The gavel struck wood like a death sentence. A small girl stood trembling on the auction platform, silent tears carving tracks through the dirt on her hollow cheeks. The crowd of respectable townsfolk looked anywhere but at her, at their boots, at the sky, at the church steeple rising white and judgmental above the square. No one wanted the broken child who never spoke. Then a shadow fell across the platform. The auctioneer's voice died mid-sentence. Every head turned toward the tall figure emerging from the alley, and mothers instinctively pulled their children closer. Elias Creed had come down from his mountain. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far Lena's story travels. And if this beginning grabbed you, hit that like button. You're going to want to stay until the very end. The September sun beat down on Stillwater's town square with the kind of heat that made tempers short and charity shorter. Dust hung in the air, stirred by the restless shifting of boots and the occasional swish of a skirt. The crowd had gathered for the quarterly auction: cattle, furniture, unclaimed property, and today, one unwanted child. She stood on the raised wooden platform beside a stack of cedar lumber and a grandfather clock that had stopped working 3 years prior. Someone had tried to clean her up. Her dark hair had been combed, though it hung limp and uneven around a face too thin for her 7 or 8 years. The dress they'd put her in was charitable donation quality, faded blue calico that hung loose at the shoulders and dragged in the dust at her feet. But it was her eyes that unsettled people most. They were large and dark and utterly empty, staring at nothing, seeing everything, revealing not a single thought or feeling. "Lot 17, announced Howard Bentley, the auctioneer, with considerably less enthusiasm than he'd shown for the livestock. He was a portly man with mutton chop whiskers and a voice that carried across 3 counties when he wanted it to. Now it barely reached the front row. Orphan child, female, approximately 7 years of age, healthy enough, quiet disposition. Someone in the crowd snorted at that last bit. Quiet was a generous word for a child who hadn't spoken a single word in the 6 months since the wagon accident that killed her parents and left her the only survivor. The church ladies who'd taken her in called it shock. The doctor called it selective mutism. The children called her ghost girl and threw pebbles when the adults weren't watching. "Come now, folks," Bentley continued, mopping his brow with a handkerchief that had seen better days. "Someone must need help around the house. The girl can work. She's young enough to train up proper." The crowd shuffled. Eyes found the ground, the sky, the buildings surrounding the square, anywhere but the small figure on the platform. Martha Henley whispered something to her husband, who shook his head firmly. The Reverend's wife examined her gloves with sudden intense interest. Even the saloon girls who'd wandered over out of boredom looked uncomfortable. "She eats like a bird," Bentley tried again, desperation creeping into his voice. The territorial authorities had made it clear the child was Stillwater's problem to solve. "Won't cost you hardly nothing to feed, and she's quiet, like I said. Won't be no trouble at all." Still nothing. The silence stretched, broken only by the creak of the platform boards and the distant hammer of the blacksmith who'd declined to close shop for the auction. That's when Lena, though she wasn't called Lena yet, just the girl, or that poor thing, did something unexpected. Her gaze, which had been fixed on some invisible point in the middle distance, shifted. Slowly, deliberately, she looked directly at the crowd. Not at anyone in particular, but at all of them collectively. And in that moment, those empty eyes weren't empty at all. They were full of knowledge far too old for a child's face. Knowledge of exactly how unwanted she was, how burdensome, how easy it would be for all these good Christian people to let her vanish into the territorial orphanage system, or worse. Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, actually flinched and took a step backward. "Starting bid," Bentley said, his voice now barely above a murmur. $5, just to cover the county's expenses. The silence that followed was the kind that pressed against eardrums and made people aware of their own breathing. Then came the voice from the back of the crowd, low and rough as gravel scraping stone. 500! The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. Heads whipped around, women gasped, men's hands instinctively moved toward weapons they weren't carrying in town. The mass of bodies parted like the Red Sea, creating a corridor down which a single figure walked with the unhurried confidence of someone who'd stopped caring about public opinion a long time ago. Elias Creed stood 6'3" in his worn leather boots. His shoulders were broad enough to fill a doorway. his hands large and scarred from years of labor and fighting and survival in places where weakness meant death. He wore canvas trousers stained with pine sap and dirt, a shirt that might have been white once but was now the color of old snow, and a heavy coat despite the heat, the kind of coat that had deep pockets and could conceal all manner of things. His hair was dark and overlong, shot through with silver at the temples, and his face was all hard angles and old scars partially hidden by several days of stubble. But it was his eyes that made people nervous. They were a pale, cold gray, like winter ice over deep water, and they looked at the world with the kind of assessment that came from spending years watching your back in hostile territory. He'd been handsome once, probably, before whatever had happened to put that permanent wariness in his expression and that slight hitch in his stride, legacy of an old wound that pained him in cold weather. $500, he repeated, stopping at the edge of the platform. He didn't look at the crowd, didn't acknowledge their shock or fear, or the way mothers were pulling children behind their skirts. His attention was fixed entirely on the small girl on the platform. Bentley's face had gone pale beneath his sunburn. Mr. Creed, I don't think you were taking bids. Elias reached into his coat, and 3 men in the crowd tensed before relaxing when he withdrew only a leather pouch. He tossed it onto the platform where it landed with the heavy clink of gold coin. That's 500 in territorial script and gold. Count it if you like. The auctioneer made no move toward the pouch. His eyes darted to the crowd, to the sheriff who stood frozen at the periphery, back to Elias. Sir, perhaps we should discuss. Nothing to discuss. Elias's voice didn't rise, but it cut through Bentley's stammering like a blade through butter. This is an auction. I made a bid. You going to accept legal tender or not? Sheriff Dalton finally found his spine and stepped forward, one hand resting on his gun belt in a gesture that was probably meant to be casual but fooled no one. Now, Elias, let's everybody just settle down here. Maybe you don't understand the situation. I understand fine, Tom. Elias's gaze didn't leave the child. Girl needs a home. I'm offering one. That's how this works, isn't it? Or are we adding new rules because you don't like who's doing the buying? It ain't about like or dislike, Dalton said, though his expression suggested otherwise. It's about what's proper, what's safe. You live up on that mountain all alone, no wife, no family. It ain't fitting for a man in your position to take in a young girl. My position. Elias finally turned his attention to the sheriff, and Dalton actually took a half step back. You mean my cabin's isolated? My past got some dark in it. I don't come to town for socials and church suppers. That about cover it? That's not what I... Yes, it is. Elias looked back at the girl, who was watching this exchange with those unreadable dark eyes. But tell me, Tom, all these good people standing here, all proper and fitting and civilized, where were their bids? Where was their Christian charity when this child was standing up here being sold like livestock? Silence. Dalton's jaw worked, but no words came out. Elias turned back to Bentley. The bid stands. $500. Going to bang that gavel, or do we need to get the territorial judge involved in why an auction was refused legal currency? Bentley looked at the sheriff. The sheriff looked at the crowd. The crowd looked at their feet. Somewhere in the back, a woman started praying in a whisper that carried farther than she probably intended. Sold, Bentley finally said, the word barely audible. The gavel came down without its usual decisive crack, more like a whisper of wood on wood. Elias stepped onto the platform, his boots making the boards groan. Up close, he was even more imposing, towering over the small girl like a mountain over a valley. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting for something. Violence, maybe. Cruelty. Confirmation of every whispered suspicion about the hermit who lived high in the timber where civilized folk had no business going. Instead, Elias did something no one expected. He knelt down on one knee, bringing himself to the child's eye level. The movement was slow, deliberate, non-threatening, the way you'd approach a wild animal you didn't want to spook. I'm Elias, he said quietly, his rough voice gentling in a way that startled those close enough to hear. I got a cabin up in the mountains. It's quiet up there, safe. I'm offering you a place to stay if you'll have it. No obligations, no expectations, just a roof and a fire and food when you're hungry. You understand?" The girl didn't respond, didn't blink, didn't acknowledge his words in any way. She just stared at him with those ancient, knowing eyes. "Right," Elias said after a moment. "Not much for talking. That's fine. Take your time." He straightened slowly, wincing slightly as his bad leg protested the movement. Then he looked at Bentley. "She got belongings?" "Just what she's wearing," the auctioneer said, relieved to be discussing logistics rather than morality. The church ladies kept what was salvaged from the wagon, said it was too painful for the girl to see. "Uh-huh?" Elias's tone suggested exactly what he thought of that reasoning. Anything that was hers by right should come with her. Her parents' things, papers, photos, whatever survived. "Now see here," Reverend Michaels pushed forward, his round face flushed with indignation and something that might have been guilt. "Those items are being held in trust until the child is of age to—" "The child is standing right here." Elias's voice went cold. "And those items belong to her, not to you, not to the church, to her. You can load them in my wagon, or you can explain to the territorial authorities why you're withholding a minor's legal inheritance." The Reverend sputtered, but his wife placed a restraining hand on his arm and whispered urgently in his ear. After a moment, he deflated. "Mrs. Michaels will gather what there is," he said stiffly. "Appreciated." Elias turned back to the girl. "Can you walk on your own, or do you need help?" For the first time, the child moved. She took a small step backward, her hands coming up slightly in a defensive gesture so subtle most people would have missed it. But Elias saw it, understood it. "Right," he said again, and this time there was something in his voice. Recognition, maybe. Kinship. "We'll take it slow then." He didn't reach for her, didn't crowd her space. Instead, he simply turned and walked toward the steps leading down from the platform, moving with the assumption that she would follow because she chose to, not because she was forced. The crowd watched, hypnotized by the strangeness of the moment, as the small girl hesitated for exactly 3 heartbeats before taking one careful step after another, following the mountain man down from the platform and through the parting crowd. Elias's wagon was a sturdy farm cart pulled by 2 massive draft horses that looked better fed and better cared for than most people's children. He'd clearly made the long trip down from his mountain specifically for this purpose, though how he'd known about the auction was anyone's guess. The wagon bed was lined with fresh straw and contained supplies: flour, sugar, salt, coffee, ammunition, a new crosscut saw, bolts of canvas and wool fabric, and a small wooden crate that seemed out of place among the practical goods. He opened the crate and pulled out a blanket. Not some rough trade blanket, but a proper wool one in deep blue, clean and soft. He spread it over the straw in the wagon bed. "You can ride back there if you like. It's a long trip, probably 6-7 hours up to my place. We'll stop if you need to." The girl looked at the wagon, at him, at the crowd still watching from the square. Then, with movements as careful and deliberate as a cat, she climbed into the wagon bed and sat down on the blanket, her back against the side panel, her knees drawn up to her chest. Mrs. Michaels came rushing up with a small wooden box, breathing hard from the exertion. This is all there was," she panted, thrusting it at Elias. "A few photographs, some letters, her mother's wedding ring, her father's pocket watch. We kept it safe." Elias took the box and looked inside. His jaw tightened. "This is it? From a whole family wagon?" "The rest was damaged in the accident," Mrs. Michaels said, not quite meeting his eyes. "Or sold to cover burial expenses and the child's keep." "I see." Elias closed the box and handed it directly to the girl, who took it with trembling hands and clutched it to her chest like the treasure it was. "Thank you for your care," he said to Mrs. Michaels, and even though his words were polite, there was no warmth in them. He climbed up to the driver's bench, gathered the reins, and clicked to the horses. The wagon lurched into motion, and the crowd watched it roll down Main Street toward the mountain road that led up into the timber and eventually into the high country, where the maps became vague and the civilized world fell away. "Someone should stop him," a woman's voice said from the crowd. "On what grounds?" Sheriff Dalton replied wearily. "He made a legal bid, paid in full, got witnesses to everything he said and did. He was a damn sight more proper about it than anyone else here today." "But his reputation," Dalton cut her off. is mostly gossip and ghost stories. Man wants to be left alone. Crime in that now? It ain't natural, someone else muttered. Living up there all alone. They say he was a soldier, a gunfighter. They say he killed. They say a lot of things, Dalton said sharply. Most of it horse shit. Elias Creed served his country, took his wounds, and came home to find his family dead of fever while he was gone. He bought that mountain land legal and paid in full. He don't cause trouble. Don't break laws. And today, he did something the rest of us should be ashamed we didn't think to do. Gave that child a chance. He paused, looking at the faces around him. Now, if anyone's got evidence of actual wrongdoing, bring it to my office. Otherwise, I suggest we all think hard about what happened here today, and maybe show up next time charity's needed before it comes down to a man like Elias Creed shaming us into doing right. The crowd dispersed slowly, muttering among themselves, already spinning the day's events into stories that would grow in the telling. By nightfall, Elias Creed would be everything from a secret saint to a demon in human form, depending on who was doing the talking. Neither story would be entirely true. The road up into the mountains was rough, carved from necessity rather than any engineering skill. The wagon jolted and swayed as the horses pulled steadily upward, their muscles bunching and releasing beneath their harnesses. The afternoon sun slanted through the pine trees, creating patterns of light and shadow that flickered across the wagon bed. Elias didn't try to make conversation. He drove in silence, occasionally glancing back to make sure the girl was still there, still breathing, still tolerating the journey. She sat exactly as she had in town, knees to chest, box clutched tight, eyes tracking the changing landscape with unreadable intensity. After about 2 hours, he pulled the wagon to a stop near a creek crossing. We'll rest the horses here, he said, climbing down and moving to check their harnesses and water them. There's bread and cheese in the basket by your feet if you're hungry. Creek water's clean for drinking if you're thirsty. The girl didn't move. Elias shrugged and went about his business, letting the horses drink their fill and graze on the grass growing near the water. He pulled out his own canteen and a piece of jerky, eating standing up while watching the surrounding forest with the automatic vigilance of someone who'd spent too many years in places where inattention meant death. After a while, he noticed the girl had moved. She was peering into the basket, her small hand reaching tentatively toward the bread wrapped in cloth. She glanced at him, clearly checking if this was a test or a trap. It's yours, he said simply. Eat what you want, leave what you don't. She took the bread and a small piece of cheese, then retreated to her corner of the wagon bed. She ate in tiny bites, slowly, making the food last, making sure it was real before she trusted it. Elias recognized that behavior. He'd seen it in prison camps, in orphanages, in the eyes of soldiers who'd survived sieges where food was scarce and trust was fatal. She was a child who'd learned that nothing was certain, nothing was safe, and anything good could be snatched away without warning. He finished his own sparse meal and hitched up the horses again. Few more hours, he told her. Get steeper from here, but we'll be home before full dark. Home. The word hung in the air between them. The girl's eyes flickered with something that might have been hope or might have been fear. With her, it was impossible to tell. The cabin revealed itself gradually as they climbed higher, first as a glint of window glass catching the lowering sun, then as a solid structure of logs and stone emerging from the forest like it had grown there naturally. It sat in a clearing on a shelf of land with the mountain rising behind it, and a long view down the valley to where Stillwater was just a smudge of smoke in the distance. It was larger than expected, not a one-room shack but a proper cabin with what looked like at least 2 rooms, maybe 3. The logs were well chinked against weather, the roof was sound shake shingles rather than sod, and there was a stone chimney already releasing a thin trail of smoke into the evening air. Left the fire bank this morning, Elias explained, seeing her notice the smoke. Keeps the cabin warm. Gets cold up here, even in September. He pulled the wagon up to a small barn that stood behind the cabin. The structure was tidy, well-maintained, with a chicken coop attached to one side, several brown hens scratched in the dirt, and a rooster eyed the wagon suspiciously from his perch. This is it, Elias said, setting the brake and climbing down. Not much, but it's solid. Keeps the weather out and the warmth in. He moved to the back of the wagon and stood there, not reaching for her. You can come down when you're ready. The girl sat in the wagon, clutching her box, looking at this place that was supposed to be something the town had called it, but she couldn't quite believe. Safe. The clearing was quiet except for natural sounds, wind in the pines, the distant call of a crow, the soft clucking of chickens. No voices, no footsteps, no sudden movements or harsh words or the thousand small dangers that seemed to follow her everywhere in Stillwater. Slowly, she set her box down and climbed over the wagon side, dropping to the ground with a small thud. She stood there, swaying slightly from the long journey, looking at the cabin that was supposed to be her home now. Elias walked toward the front door, his uneven gait more pronounced after hours of sitting. "Come on, I'll show you inside, then get the horses settled." The cabin's interior was as surprising as its exterior. The main room held a stone fireplace large enough to stand in, with a proper iron cooking crane and a Dutch oven sitting in the coals. There was a solid wooden table with 4 chairs that looked handmade but skillfully so, a pair of rocking chairs near the fire, shelves lined with books and supplies, and braided rag rugs on the plank floor. Everything was clean, organized, maintained, the home of someone who took pride in his space even if no one else ever saw it. "There's 2 bedrooms," Elias said, pointing to doors on either side of the main room. "I use the one on the left. The one on the right, well, it's been storage mostly, but I cleared it out last week. Put in a bed and a dresser. It's yours now if you want it." He crossed to the door and opened it. The small room beyond held a narrow bed with a real mattress and clean quilts, a simple wooden dresser, a chair, and a window that looked out toward the valley. On the dresser sat an oil lamp and something else, a wooden box carved with simple flower patterns. "Found that at a trader's camp last spring," Elias said gruffly. "Was going to use it for ammunition storage, but seems like it'd suit you better, for keeping things private like." The girl stepped into the room slowly, her eyes wide. It was small, yes, but it was clean and warm and hers. The bed had been made with obvious care. The window had real glass, not just oiled paper. The floor had a small rag rug beside the bed, something soft to step on in the morning. She turned to look at Elias, and for the first time something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, not yet, but the hardness around her eyes softened just a fraction. "You settle in," Elias said. "Put your things where you like. I'm going to tend the horses and get water from the spring. There's a chamber pot under the bed, but the outhouse is behind the cabin, about 20 yards. Path's clear. Tomorrow I'll show you around proper, where everything is, what's what. But tonight you just rest. You've had a long day." He started to leave, then paused in the doorway. "One more thing, I don't know what name you prefer, what your parents called you, but I can't keep thinking of you as the girl. So unless you tell me different, I'm going to call you Lena. It means light, or so I'm told. Seems fitting somehow." He left before she could respond, if she'd been inclined to, which she wasn't. She heard his boots cross the main room, heard the front door open and close, heard his uneven footsteps fade toward the barn. Lena, for that was who she was now, whether she'd chosen it or not, stood in the middle of her new room holding her small wooden box of memories and trying to understand what had just happened to her life. This morning, she'd been nothing, nobody, unwanted property on an auction block. Now she was standing in a room that was hers, in a cabin on a mountain, with a man who was terrifying and gentle all at once, and who had paid a fortune for the privilege of giving her shelter. It made no sense. Nothing in her short, brutal experience had prepared her for kindness without conditions, for help without expectation of return. There had to be a catch. Had to be a price she'd eventually be asked to pay. But as the evening light faded and she heard Elias moving around outside, doing the ordinary chores of an ordinary evening, she felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest. It wasn't trust, not yet, not nearly yet. But it was the faintest, most fragile possibility that maybe, just maybe, she might be allowed to rest. To stop running, to stop hiding, to simply exist without constantly bracing for the next blow. She opened her wooden box, the one from her parents, and carefully arranged its contents on top of the dresser. A tintype photograph of a stern-faced man and a gentle-looking woman on their wedding day. 3 letters tied with faded ribbon, a pocket watch that no longer ticked, a gold wedding band sized for a woman's finger, all that remained of people who had loved her once. All that remained of a life that ended on a dusty road when a wagon wheel broke and horses panicked, and everything went wrong in the space of minutes. She touched the photograph gently, tracing her mother's face. Then she opened the carved box Elias had left for her and carefully placed her parents' box inside it. One treasure protecting another. Outside, night was falling fast the way it did in the mountains. She heard Elias return from the barn, heard him moving around the main room, heard the crackle as he built up the fire. The smell of coffee drifted through her open door, followed by the scent of frying bacon and something else. Bread warming, maybe. After a while, his voice came quiet and unhurried. "Food's ready if you're hungry, no pressure. I'll leave a plate warm by the fire if you're not ready to eat." Lena stood in her room, listening to him move around the cabin. Every survival instinct told her to stay hidden, stay safe, stay small and invisible, the way she'd learned to in Stillwater. But a small, stubborn part of her, the part that had somehow survived wagon accidents and loss, and 6 months of being treated like broken furniture, whispered that maybe this was different. Maybe this mountain, this cabin, this strange man with sad eyes and a gentle voice, maybe this was the safe place that everyone kept promising existed, but she'd never actually found. She took a breath, squared her small shoulders, and walked out into the main room. Elias stood at the stove, his back to her, dishing beans onto 2 tin plates. He didn't turn around, didn't make a fuss, just said in that same quiet voice, "Coffee's probably too strong for you. I got milk from the neighbor's place yesterday. Keeps cold in the spring box. Or there's water in the pitcher." He set both plates on the table, along with utensils and tin cups. Then he did something that surprised her again. Instead of sitting down immediately, he waited. Waited for her to choose where she wanted to sit. Waited for her to feel safe enough to approach. She chose the chair facing the door, automatic defensive positioning that Elias recognized and respected. He took the chair across from her, angling himself slightly so she could see both him and the exit without having to constantly look back and forth. "Tomorrow," he said, cutting into his bacon, "I'll show you how everything works around here. Where the spring is, how to feed the chickens, where I keep supplies. You don't have to help if you don't want to. That's not why you're here. But I figure it's good to know where things are. Makes a place feel less strange." Lena picked up her fork. The food smelled better than anything she'd eaten in months. In Stillwater, the church ladies had fed her, but always with the air of it being a burden, a duty, a reminder that she was charity and should be grateful. This felt different. This felt like Elias had made enough for 2 because 2 people lived here now. Simple as that. She took a small bite of bacon, then another, then beans, then a piece of bread that had been fried in the bacon grease and tasted like heaven. Elias ate his own meal in comfortable silence, not watching her, not commenting, just sharing space at the table the way people did when they belonged in the same place. After they finished, he cleared the plates and washed them in the basin, his movements economical and practiced. "I usually read a bit before bed," he said. "You're welcome to pick a book from the shelf, or just sit by the fire if you prefer. Or go to bed, no rules about it. You set your own schedule here." Lena looked at the bookshelf. There were maybe 30 books, an impressive collection for a mountain cabin. She recognized a few titles from before when her mother used to read to her. Most were practical, farming guides, carpentry manuals, a medical reference. But there were others, collections of poetry, a volume of folk tales, several novels with worn spines that showed they'd been read multiple times. She crossed to the shelf and ran her finger along the spines, not quite brave enough to actually pull one down. "That one's good," Elias said, pointing to a slim volume. "Stories from different countries. Got pictures. I marked the ones I liked best." She pulled it out carefully. The cover showed a ship sailing across a star-filled sea. Inside, just as he'd said, were illustrations, woodcut prints of castles and forests and strange creatures, and on some pages, small penciled check marks in the margins. She carried the book to one of the rocking chairs by the fire and sat down, curling her legs under her. The chair was too big for her, but somehow that made it feel safer, like she could disappear into it if she needed to. Elias settled into the other chair with his own book, something technical about timber management, and for a while there was only the sound of turning pages and crackling fire and wind outside the cabin. It was the most peaceful evening Lena had experienced in as long as she could remember. When her eyes started to droop, she carefully marked her place in the book and stood up. Elias glanced up from his reading. "Sleep well, Lena," he said simply. She carried the book to her room and set it on her dresser next to her carved box. Then she changed into the nightdress that had appeared on her bed while she was eating dinner. Simple white cotton, clean and soft and sized correctly, which meant Elias must have bought it specifically for her, must have planned this whole thing before he ever came down to Stillwater. She climbed into bed and pulled the quilts up to her chin. The mattress was filled with what felt like fresh straw and corn husks, comfortable and clean. The pillow smelled like lavender and sunshine. Through her partially open door, she could see the main room. Could see Elias in his chair, still reading, the firelight turning his scarred face into planes of light and shadow. He looked tired. Sad, maybe. But not dangerous. Not cruel. Just a man who'd somehow decided that a broken, silent child deserved a second chance at life. As Lena drifted toward sleep, she heard him moving around, banking the fire, checking the door and windows with the automatic thoroughness of someone who'd lived in dangerous places. She heard his bedroom door open and close, heard the creak of his bed taking his weight. Then silence, deep mountain silence that wrapped around the cabin like a blanket. And for the first time in 6 months, Lena fell asleep without fear. The first morning came with pale light filtering through pine branches and the distant call of a hawk riding the thermals above the valley. Lena woke slowly, disoriented by the unfamiliar softness of the bed, the clean smell of the quilts, the absolute quiet that surrounded the cabin. For a moment she couldn't remember where she was, and panic fluttered in her chest like a trapped bird. Then memory returned. The auction, the wagon ride, the mountain man who'd bought her freedom with a leather pouch of gold. The cabin. Her room. Safety, maybe, though that word still felt too dangerous to fully believe. She lay still, listening. From beyond her door came the soft sounds of someone moving carefully, trying not to wake a sleeping child. The clink of a poker against iron, the quiet scrape of a kettle being set on the stove, footsteps crossing to the door and back again. Elias was already up, had probably been up for hours if the gray quality of the light was any indication. Mountain folk rose with the sun, or before it, she remembered her father saying once, back when she'd had a father to say such things. She climbed out of bed and dressed quickly in the same calico dress from yesterday, the only dress she owned. Her feet were bare, and the wooden floor was cold against her skin, but she made no sound as she crossed to the door and peered out. Elias stood at the stove with his back to her, dressed in work clothes and suspenders, his dark hair still damp from what must have been a trip to the creek. He was frying eggs in a cast-iron skillet, moving with the economy of motion that came from years of cooking for one. On the table sat a plate of biscuits and a small jar of what looked like honey. "Morning," he said without turning around, somehow knowing she was there despite her silence. "Water's warm in the basin if you want to wash up. There's a towel on the hook." Lena padded across to the wash basin and found it filled with water that steamed gently in the cool morning air. A bar of soap sat beside it, real soap, not the harsh lye stuff the church ladies had used, and a clean towel hung from a nail driven into the wall. She washed her face and hands, the warm water a small luxury that made her throat tight. When she turned back, Elias had set out 2 plates with eggs and biscuits. He poured coffee for himself and milk for her, the white liquid cool from the spring box he'd mentioned yesterday. "Eat while it's hot," he said, settling into his chair. "Then I'll show you around the place. Help you get your bearings." They ate in silence, but it was becoming a comfortable kind of quiet. Not the awful silence of Stillwater where people looked through her like she was glass, but something else, something that felt almost like peace. After breakfast, Elias led her outside into the crisp mountain morning. The air was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke and the wild smell of places where humans were visitors rather than conquerors. Frost still clung to the grass in shaded spots, and Lena's bare feet left small prints in the silvered ground. Elias noticed immediately. His jaw tightened and he disappeared back into the cabin without a word. When he returned, he carried a pair of boots. Too large for her, clearly meant for a boy, but serviceable. "Belong to—" he started, then stopped. "They'll be too big, but stuff some cloth in the toes. Can't have you walking around barefoot. Ground's too rough, and winter's coming." Lena took the boots and pulled them on. They were indeed too large, swallowing her small feet, but they were sturdy leather and well-maintained. She stood there looking at them, at this man who kept giving her things without asking for anything in return, and felt that unfamiliar tightness in her throat again. "Come on," Elias said, already moving toward the barn. "Lots to see." He showed her everything with patient thoroughness. The barn where the draft horses lived in clean stalls with fresh straw. The chicken coop where 7 hens and 1 aggressive rooster held court, and where Elias demonstrated how to scatter feed and collect eggs without getting pecked. The spring box built into the hillside where milk and butter and meat stayed cold even in summer. The smokehouse where venison and bacon hung in fragrant strips. The woodshed stacked to the rafters with split logs. Enough to last through a hard winter, and then some. "Water comes from that spring up the hill," he said, pointing to where a small stream tumbled down the mountainside. "Purest you'll find anywhere. Cold as December even in August. We keep buckets by the door for drinking and cooking. For washing and bathing, we heat it on the stove." He walked her around the perimeter of the clearing, showing her the property lines marked by stacked stones and blazed trees. "This is ours. 40 acres I bought legal from the territorial office. Beyond that line to the north is federal land. To the south is the Morrison place, about 5 miles down the mountain. Good people. Keep to themselves mostly, like I do. Their daughter Emma sometimes comes up here selling butter and eggs, brings news from town." Lena listened to everything, her dark eyes tracking his movements, absorbing information the way a sponge absorbed water. She didn't speak, but she was clearly paying attention, filing away every detail. They were walking back toward the cabin when Elias suddenly stopped. "Almost forgot." He changed direction toward a small outbuilding Lena hadn't noticed before, more of a lean-to than a proper structure, built against a large boulder and nearly hidden by overgrown brush. He pulled open the sagging door and stepped inside. Lena hesitated, then followed. The interior was dim and dusty, filled with old tools and forgotten projects. But in the corner, covered with canvas, was something that made Elias's expression do something complicated. He pulled the canvas away to reveal a child's rocking horse, beautifully carved from pine, painted gray with a black mane and tail. One of the rockers was cracked, and the paint was faded, but it had clearly been made with love and skill. "Made this a long time ago," Elias said quietly, running his hand along the horse's carved mane, "for someone who never got to use it." He was silent for a moment, lost somewhere in the past. Then he shook himself and looked at Lena. "You're probably too old for toys now, but if you want it, I could fix it up. Or if you'd rather I didn't drag out old things, that's fine too. Just thought you should know it's here." Lena stared at the rocking horse, at this artifact from someone else's tragedy, offered to her as casually as breakfast. She reached out slowly and touched the horse's nose, her small fingers tracing the carved nostrils and the gentle curve of its neck. "Right," Elias said, reading her silence in whatever way made sense to him. "I'll work on it when I have time. For now, let's get you sorted with some proper clothes. That dress is about worn through, and you'll need warmer things anyway. Winter comes hard up here." They spent the rest of the morning in the cabin. Elias pulled out bolts of fabric from his supply chest, practical cotton and wool and blues and browns, and a basket of sewing notions that seemed incongruous with his rough hands and rougher reputation. "I can do basic mending," he said, seeing her surprise. "Lived alone too long not to learn, but making a whole dress is beyond me. Emma Morrison's got talent with a needle. She can help." He paused. "Unless you know how. Your mother teach you?" Lena shook her head. The movement was small but definite, the first clear communication she'd made since arriving. "That's fine, we'll figure it out." Elias measured her roughly with a length of string, tying knots to mark lengths, then wrote numbers on a scrap of paper in a careful, unpracticed hand that suggested education hadn't come easy to him. "Emma's coming by tomorrow or the next day. I'll ask her then." The afternoon brought chores. Elias worked with quiet efficiency, splitting wood, repairing a broken hinge on the chicken coop, checking trap lines he had set for rabbits. He didn't ask Lena to help, but he didn't send her away either. She followed him like a small shadow, watching everything, learning the rhythm of mountain life. When he split wood, she noticed how he positioned the logs, how he read the grain before swinging the axe, how he stacked the split pieces so air could circulate and keep them dry. When he checked the traps, she saw how he reset them carefully, how he handled the 2 rabbits he'd caught with respect rather than casual cruelty, making their deaths quick and clean. Nothing dies for sport up here, he said, field dressing the rabbits with practiced efficiency. We take what we need, no more. And we use everything: meat for eating, hide for leather, bones for tools, or soup stock. That's the rule. That evening, he showed her how to skin and clean the rabbits, his hands guiding hers through the motions without actually touching her unless she allowed it. You don't have to learn this if you don't want, he said, but it's useful knowledge. Makes you less dependent on other people, and independence is worth more than gold up here. Lena watched closely as he worked, her small hands mimicking his movements when he handed her the second rabbit. She was clumsy and slow, but determined. When she finally finished, her hands were bloody and her face was pale, but she'd done it. Good, Elias said simply. You've got steady hands. That's rare. He set the cleaned meat in the spring box and poured water over her hands, washing away the blood. Tomorrow, we'll make stew. Rabbit's best when it's cooked slow with vegetables and herbs. They fell into a routine over the next several days. Elias woke before dawn and did the early chores, feeding animals, collecting eggs, hauling water, building up the fire. Lena woke to the sounds of domestic life and learned to wash and dress herself, to make her bed with the precision Elias seemed to value, to come to breakfast when called. After meals, they worked. Elias was always busy. There was always something that needed fixing, building, preparing for the coming winter. And Lena watched it all, absorbing lessons in survival and self-sufficiency without a single word being spoken. In the evenings, they sat by the fire with their books. Elias read his technical manuals and sometimes made notes in a leather journal. Lena worked her way through the illustrated story collection, studying the pictures as much as the words. She could read, her mother had taught her before the accident, but some of the words were unfamiliar, and she sometimes found herself puzzling over passages. One evening, she must have been staring at the same page too long because Elias glanced over and said, "Something confusing?" She hesitated, then carried the book over and pointed to a word. Wanderlust, Elias read, means a strong desire to travel, to see new places. Some people got it in their blood, can't stay in one spot too long before they get restless. He looked at her. You got wanderlust, you think? Lena shook her head firmly. The motion was vehement, almost violent. No, she did not want to travel. She did not want to see new places. She wanted to stay here, in this cabin, where nobody looked at her with pity or disgust or calculation. Good, Elias said quietly. Because this is home now, long as you want it to be. No expiration on that. It was the closest thing to a promise he'd made, and something in Lena's chest loosened slightly. She returned to her chair and continued reading, the word wanderlust now carrying meaning it hadn't before. Emma Morrison arrived on the 5th day, riding a sturdy mountain pony and carrying saddlebags full of goods for trade. She was 17 or 18, with sun-browned skin and blonde hair in a practical braid, wearing split riding skirts and boots that had seen serious use. Her face was open and friendly, unmarked by the suspicion that seemed to mark everyone from Stillwater. Elias, she called out, dismounting with easy grace, brought you butter and cream, fresh-baked bread, and Ma sent a jar of her blackberry preserves. She said you can't live on meat and coffee alone, no matter what you... She stopped mid-sentence, seeing Lena standing half-hidden behind the cabin door. Oh. This is Lena, Elias said, his tone carrying a subtle warning. She's living here now. Lena, this is Emma Morrison. Her family's our closest neighbors. Emma's eyes went wide. The girl from the auction. Word traveled fast about that. She studied Lena with open curiosity, but no malice. Town's still talking about it. Half think you're a saint, other half think you've lost your mind. And what do you think? Elias asked mildly. I think you've got more decency than the whole town combined. Emma tied her pony to the hitching post and pulled her saddlebags down. And I think this child looks like she could use some proper clothes and maybe a friend who doesn't have a beard. Elias's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. That's actually why I was hoping you'd come by. Got fabric and measurements. Was hoping you might help with some dresses. I'll trade labor or goods, whatever your family needs. Oh, Elias, you don't need to... Yes, I do. Fair trade. That's how it works. Emma sighed but nodded. Fine. Pa could use help with the big barn roof before snow flies. 2 days of work and we'll call it even. She turned to Lena. What do you say, little miss? Want to pick out some nice fabric for new dresses? Lena looked at Elias, who nodded encouragingly. Then, slowly, she came out from behind the door and approached Emma. "That's it," Emma said gently. "I don't bite, I promise. Though I do talk a lot. Fair warning on that. My brothers say I could talk the ears off a mule." She knelt down to Lena's level. "You don't talk much, I hear. That's fine. You can just nod or shake your head, and we'll get along just fine." Over the next hour, Emma transformed the cabin's main room into an impromptu sewing workshop. She laid out the fabric bolts, pulled out patterns and measuring tapes, and chattered continuously while Lena stood still and let herself be measured and fitted. "Blue's good on you," Emma said, holding up a piece of cornflower cotton against Lena's face. "Brings out the color in your eyes. And this brown wool will be warm for winter. We can trim it with some ribbon maybe, make it pretty but practical." She glanced at Elias. "You did good with these measurements. Most men would have bought fabric without any idea of size and ended up with enough for 3 people or not enough for 1. Had practice measuring for—" Elias stopped. "A long time ago." Emma's expression softened with understanding. Everyone in the territory knew bits and pieces of Elias Creed's story. The family he'd lost, the life that had been taken from him, but she had the grace not to push. "Well, you haven't lost the touch. I can have 2 dresses done by next week, and a nightgown, maybe a pinafore for working around the place." "That's too much," Elias started. "That's what 2 days of barn work buys," Emma said firmly. "Plus, I like sewing. Gives me something to do besides listen to my brothers argue about whose turn it is to muck stalls." She packed up her supplies and stood. "I should get back before dark. But Lena, I'll be back in a few days with your dresses. And if you ever want company, girl company, I mean, you're welcome at our place. It's nice having another girl around these parts." After Emma left, Elias and Lena returned to their evening routine. But something had shifted. The visit had broken up the isolation slightly, reminded them both that the mountain wasn't entirely cut off from the world below. That night, as Lena was getting ready for bed, she noticed something on her dresser that hadn't been there that morning. The wooden rocking horse, cleaned and repaired, its cracked rocker mended with careful joinery, the paint refreshed where it had faded. It was still clearly old, still carried the weight of its history, but it was whole again. Functional, beautiful in its simple craftsmanship. She touched it gently, and it rocked beneath her fingers with a soft creaking sound. When had he done this? She'd been with him most of the day, but there had been an hour or 2 after lunch when he disappeared into his workshop, saying he had some small projects to finish. She picked up the horse and carried it to the main room. Elias sat in his chair reading by firelight, his weathered face looking older in the flickering shadows. He glanced up when she approached, saw what she was carrying. Something complicated crossed his expression, pain, maybe, or memory, or both. "Thought you might like it after all," he said quietly. "It's been sitting in that shed for near about 10 years. Seems wrong to let good work go to waste." Lena hugged the horse to her chest, her small arms barely spanning its carved body. Then she did something she hadn't done since the wagon accident that killed her parents. She smiled. It was just a small upturn of her lips, barely there and gone in a moment. But Elias saw it. His own expression softened, the hard lines around his eyes easing. "You're welcome," he said, understanding what she couldn't yet say. Lena carried the horse back to her room and set it carefully in the corner where she could see it from her bed. That night she fell asleep looking at it. This gift from a man who seemed to understand that broken things could be mended if someone cared enough to try. The days grew shorter as autumn deepened its hold on the mountain. The aspens turned gold and scattered their leaves like coins across the forest floor. The air took on a sharper edge, and frost came earlier each morning, lingering longer in the shadows. Elias worked with increased urgency, preparing for winter. He chinked gaps in the cabin walls with fresh moss and clay. He repaired the shutters and oiled the hinges. He laid in supplies, flour and sugar and coffee, bought from traveling traders, salt pork and dried beans, ammunition for hunting. The root cellar filled with potatoes and carrots and turnips from the small garden plot behind the cabin. Lena helped where she could. She learned to card wool that Elias had traded for, her small fingers working the fibers into alignment. She helped sort and store dried herbs, sage and thyme, and wild mint collected from the mountain meadows. She fed the chickens each morning without being asked, learning which hen was broody and which one pecked if you weren't careful. Emma returned twice, once with the finished dresses and once just to visit. The dresses fit perfectly, simple, practical garments in blue and brown that made Lena look less like Charity and more like a child who belonged somewhere. Emma also brought a rag doll she'd made from scraps, with yarn hair and button eyes and a cheerful embroidered smile. "Every girl needs a doll," Emma said, pressing it into Lena's hands. "I made her tough. She can handle being dragged around on adventures." Lena accepted the doll gravely and carried it everywhere for the next week. She named it, not out loud, but in her head where words still lived even if they couldn't find their way to her tongue. She called it Hope because that seemed like something worth holding on to. One morning, nearly 3 weeks after the auction, Lena woke to find the world transformed. Snow had fallen during the night, the first real snow of the season, and it covered everything in pristine white. The clearing looked like something from a picture book, and the cabin felt even more isolated, even more removed from the world below. Elias was already up, as always, standing at the window with his coffee and looking out at the changed landscape. "First snow," he said when Lena joined him. "Early this year, winter's going to be hard." He glanced down at her. "You ever see snow before?" She nodded. Yes, she'd seen snow, but not like this. Not snow that felt like protection rather than threat, that made the world quiet and clean instead of cold and dangerous. "Want to go out in it?" She nodded again, more vigorously this time. They bundled up in coats and scarves, and Elias found a pair of wool socks to stuff into her 2 large boots. Then they stepped out into the transformed world. The snow was 4 or 5 inches deep, unmarked except by the delicate tracks of rabbits and birds. Lena took a few tentative steps, feeling the soft crunch beneath her boots, watching her breath cloud in the frigid air. Then, because she was still a child despite everything she'd been through, she reached down and scooped up a handful of snow. It was perfect packing snow, and she formed it into a ball with growing excitement. Elias saw what she was doing and raised an eyebrow. "You planning to start something you can't finish?" She threw the snowball. It hit him square in the chest and exploded into powder. Then she waited, tense, to see if she'd crossed some invisible line, broken some rule she didn't know existed. Elias looked down at the snow on his coat, looked at Lena's anxious face, and then, for the first time since she'd met him, he laughed. It was a rusty sound, like something that hadn't been used in a long time, but it was genuine. "Fair enough," he said, and bent to scoop up his own snowball. What followed was brief, but glorious. They threw snow at each other like the child and the damaged man they were, laughing and dodging and forgetting for just a few minutes all the reasons why laughter had become rare. Lena's silence didn't matter in the snow. Her lack of words didn't diminish her joy. When they finally went back inside, both wet and cold and grinning, the cabin felt warmer than it ever had before. Elias made hot chocolate from precious cocoa stores, and they sat by the fire wrapped in blankets while their wet clothes dried. "That was good," Elias said quietly, staring into his cup. "Haven't done anything like that in a long time. Thank you." Lena looked at him over the rim of her own cup, this man who kept thanking her for things she didn't understand, for existing, for being a child, for reminding him what it felt like to be human instead of just surviving. That night, after she'd gone to bed, she heard him in the main room. Not reading this time, but moving around quietly, doing something she couldn't quite identify. She crept to her door and peered out. Elias sat at the table with a piece of paper and a pencil, working on something by lamplight. His face was creased with concentration, his scarred hands moving carefully across the page. After a while, he set the pencil down and studied what he'd created. It was a drawing, crude but recognizable, of 2 figures throwing snowballs in a clearing surrounded by pine trees. A tall man and a small girl, both caught mid-laugh, both clearly happy. He looked at it for a long moment, something complicated working across his expression. Then he carefully folded the paper and tucked it between the pages of his journal. Lena retreated to her bed before he could catch her watching. But she understood what she'd seen. He was keeping the memory, preserving this moment of simple joy the same way she'd preserved her parents' photographs and letters. They were both trying to hold on to something good in a world that had taken so much away. Winter settled over the mountain like a heavy quilt, thick and smothering and absolute. The snow that had seemed magical that first morning became a constant presence, piling higher with each storm until the world outside the cabin was defined by white and more white, broken only by the dark verticals of pine trees and the gray smoke rising from their chimney. Elias had been right about it being a hard winter. By mid-November, the snow was waist-deep in the clearing and deeper in the drifts. The trail down to Stillwater became impassable, except on snowshoes, and even then it was treacherous. They were cut off from the world below, isolated in a way that would have terrified Lena 2 months ago, but now felt almost comforting. Up here, no one could reach them. No one could take her away. No one could look at her with pity or suspicion or that calculating expression that had made her feel like livestock. The days took on a different rhythm. Morning chores became more elaborate, breaking ice on the water buckets, digging paths to the barn and outhouse, making sure the chickens had enough warmth to survive the brutal cold. Elias worked with methodical efficiency, and Lena shadowed him, learning to read the weather and the color of the sky, learning to spot the signs of frostbite before it became serious, learning 100 small skills that meant the difference between comfort and suffering in the high country. They spent long hours inside by necessity. The cabin became their entire world, its 2 bedrooms, main room, and the small workshop Elias had built onto the back where he did carpentry and repair work. It could have felt cramped, 2 people living in such close quarters with no escape from each other. But somehow it didn't. They developed an easy coexistence, each respecting the other's need for space and silence. Elias used the forced indoor time to teach Lena things he thought she should know. He showed her how to maintain the firearms. Not to use them yet, she was too small, but to clean and care for them properly. He taught her basic arithmetic using dried beans as counters, working problems that had practical applications. If you've got 3 pounds of flour and you use half a cup each day, how long will it last? If you need to trade 6 eggs for a pound of sugar and you collect 8 eggs a day, how long until you can make the trade? Lena absorbed it all silently, her dark eyes tracking his movements, her small hands mimicking his when he showed her how to do something. She was bright, he'd discovered, quick to understand and quicker to remember. She just couldn't speak, or wouldn't, and he'd stopped trying to figure out which. One evening in early December, with the wind howling outside and the fire crackling warm inside, Elias pulled down a wooden box from a high shelf. Lena watched curiously as he carried it to the table and opened it to reveal paper, pencils, a bottle of ink, and several pens with steel nibs. "You can read," he said, settling into his chair. "Your mother taught you that much, but can you write?" Lena nodded slowly. A little. She could form letters, spell simple words. Her mother had been teaching her before the accident. "Good. Then we'll work on it. Up here, words on paper might be the only way to reach the outside world come deep winter. If something happened to me, you'd need to write for help. And even if nothing happens, it's a useful skill." He set paper in front of her and showed her how to hold the pencil properly, how to form letters with consistent size and spacing. At first her hand shook, the pencil making uncertain marks, but Elias was patient, demonstrating over and over until her letters became more confident. After an hour of practice, he said, "Write me something. Anything you want. Don't worry about spelling or making it perfect. Just put words on paper." Lena stared at the blank page. The pencil felt strange in her hand, heavy with possibility. What could she say? What words could capture the confusion and gratitude and fear and hope all tangled together inside her? Finally, slowly, she wrote 3 words. "Thank you, Elias." He read them, his scarred face unreadable. Then he picked up his own pencil and wrote beneath her words, "You're welcome, Lena. You're a good kid." Something broke open in Lena's chest. She grabbed the pencil and wrote again, the words coming faster now. "Why did you buy me?" Elias was quiet for a long time, the wind filling the silence between them. When he finally wrote his response, his handwriting was less steady than usual. "Because nobody else would. Because you deserved better. Because I know what it's like to be alone and scared and treated like you don't matter." Lena read his words 3 times. Then she wrote, "You matter to me." When Elias read that, his hand went still on the table. He didn't write anything back for several minutes. When he did, his words were simple. "That means more than you know." They sat there in the firelight, having their first real conversation through pencil marks on paper, and something fundamental shifted between them. It wasn't just survival anymore, wasn't just an old man sheltering an unwanted child out of obligation. This was something else, something that felt dangerously close to family. The written conversations became a regular occurrence. After dinner, Elias would pull out the paper and they'd write back and forth, sometimes about practical things, and sometimes about nothing at all. He told her about his life before the mountain, carefully edited versions of his time in the army, his brief marriage to a woman named Catherine, the daughter they'd had, who would have been about 13 now if she'd lived. He wrote about loss and grief and the slow process of learning to survive when everything you loved was gone. Lena, in turn, wrote about her parents, about her father's laugh and her mother's singing, about the wagon journey west that was supposed to give them a fresh start, and how it ended instead in dust and blood and the terrible silence after. She wrote about the 6 months in Stillwater, about being passed from family to family like an unwanted package, about the children who threw stones and the adults who whispered when they thought she couldn't hear. I stopped talking, she wrote one night, because nobody listened anyway. Words didn't help. Silence was safer. Elias read that and sat very still. Then he wrote, "I'm listening now. When you're ready to talk out loud again, I'll be here. But there's no rush. Silence is fine too. You get to decide." December deepened. The days grew shorter until there were barely 6 hours of pale sunlight between long nights. The cold became intense, the kind that made breathing hurt and turned any exposed skin white within minutes. Elias and Lena stayed close to the cabin except when absolutely necessary, venturing out only for essential chores. Emma Morrison made one final visit before Christmas, arriving on snowshoes with her father. They brought supplies: flour and sugar, coffee and tea, dried fruit and nuts, and a small package wrapped in brown paper that Emma insisted was for Lena. "Can't stay long," Mr. Morrison said, a tall, weathered man with kind eyes and Emma's blonde hair shot through with gray. "Storm's coming tonight, big one. We wanted to check on you before we got shut in ourselves." They shared coffee and conversation around the fire. Mr. Morrison talked with Elias about timber prices and territorial politics, while Emma sat with Lena and showed her the embroidery pattern she was working on. "Pa says we probably won't see you until spring now," Emma said quietly. "The pass will be snowed shut after this next storm. You'll be all right up here? Just the two of you?" Lena nodded firmly. Yes, they would be all right. They had food and fuel in each other. What else did they need? Emma smiled. "You're tougher than you look, aren't you? I'm glad. Elias needs someone tough." She glanced at where the two men sat talking. "He's different now, you know. Since you came? Less haunted, I guess. Like he's got a reason to be more than just alive." Before they left, Emma hugged Lena tight. "Don't open that package until Christmas," she whispered. "And take care of each other, hear?" The storm Emma's father predicted hit that night with a vengeance. Wind screamed around the cabin, driving snow horizontal, piling drifts against the walls until they couldn't see the barn 20 yards away. It lasted 3 days, and when it finally cleared, the world was buried. The snow came up to the cabin's windows on the north side, and the path to the barn had to be dug out from scratch. But inside, they were warm and safe. Elias had prepared well. They had food, fuel, light, and shelter. They had books to read and paper to write on. They had the quiet companionship that had grown between them. Christmas came quietly. Neither of them had much experience with celebration. Elias's Christmases had been lonely affairs since losing his family, and Lena barely remembered the holiday from before the accident. But Emma's package changed that. Inside the brown paper was a beautiful wool scarf in deep green, clearly handmade, and a small fruitcake wrapped in cloth. There was also a note. "Merry Christmas to both of you. Here's hoping for a good year ahead. Love, Emma and the Morrison family." Elias looked at the package and then disappeared into his workshop for an hour. When he emerged, he was carrying 2 items. The first was a simple wooden box with a hinged lid and Lena carved into the top, a proper treasure box to replace the one he'd given her the first day. The second was a rag doll he'd clearly made himself, crude compared to Emma's work, but sewn with obvious care. "Thought Hope might like a friend," he said gruffly, handing her the doll. "And you needed a better place for your private things." Lena held both gifts, her eyes suspiciously bright. Then she ran to her room and came back with something wrapped in cloth. A pair of leather gloves she'd been secretly working on for weeks, stitching them during the hours when Elias was outside or in his workshop. They were rough work, the stitches uneven and the fingers slightly different lengths, but they were warm and functional and made with her own hands. Elias took them carefully, running his calloused fingers over her uncertain stitchwork. "These are fine gloves," he said quietly. "Best I've ever owned." "Thank you, Lena." They ate fruitcake for breakfast, and Elias made a special dinner. Rabbit stew with vegetables, biscuits, and dried apple pie made from their stores. They sat at the table together as the winter sun set early, and for the first time in years, neither of them felt alone. That night, Lena wrote in her small, careful hand, "This is the best Christmas I remember." Elias wrote back, "Mine too." January brought cold that made December seem mild by comparison. The temperature dropped so low that the sap froze in the pine trees and split them with sounds like rifle shots. Frost built up on the inside of the cabin windows despite the fire. Elias kept the stove going day and night, feeding it constantly, and they slept in their warmest clothes under piles of quilts. It was during one of those brutally cold nights that Lena woke screaming. The nightmare had come without warning. Twisted images of the wagon accident, of horses screaming and wheels breaking, and her mother's face the moment before everything went dark. She woke thrashing and gasping, tears streaming down her face, her voice making sounds she hadn't made in 7 months. Within seconds, Elias was there, appearing in her doorway with a lamp held high, his hair wild from sleep and his expression alert for danger. "Lena? What's wrong?" She couldn't answer with words. They still wouldn't come. But she was shaking violently, her breath coming in hitching sobs. The nightmare had been so real, so vivid, and for a moment she'd forgotten where she was, had thought she was back on that dusty road with death all around her. Elias set the lamp down and approached slowly. "Bad dream?" She nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. "Can I sit?" Another nod. He lowered himself carefully to the edge of her bed, keeping enough distance that she didn't feel trapped. "Dreams can't hurt you," he said quietly. "They feel real, I know, but they can't actually harm you. You're safe here." Lena wanted to believe him, but the images were still too fresh, too sharp. She could still smell the dust and blood, could still hear the awful sounds. "You want to write about it?" Elias asked. "Sometimes putting it on paper makes it smaller." She shook her head. "Not tonight. Tonight the dream was too big, too terrible to capture in words." "All right, then I'll stay here until you fall back asleep, if that's okay with you." Lena nodded gratefully and burrowed back under her quilts. Elias settled into the chair by her window, the lamp on the floor beside him, casting long shadows across the room. He didn't talk, didn't offer empty platitudes or false comfort. He just sat there, solid and real, a living reminder that she wasn't on that road anymore. Eventually, she drifted back to sleep. When she woke in the morning, Elias was gone, but there was a new quilt draped over her bed, one from his own room, one he'd clearly sacrificed to make sure she stayed warm. The nightmares came sporadically after that. Some nights she slept peacefully. Other nights the past came rushing back in terrible detail. But Elias was always there when she needed him, appearing in her doorway with his lamp, offering quiet presence without demanding anything in return. On one particularly bad night, after a dream that left her sobbing and shaking, Elias did something unexpected. He started talking in his low, rough voice, not about the dream or her fear, but about his daughter. "Her name was Sarah," he said quietly. "She had dark hair like yours, laughed at everything, even things that weren't funny, drove Catherine crazy sometimes, all that laughing." He paused, staring at something Lena couldn't see. "She'd be about 13 now, would have been tall, I think." Catherine was tall, graceful. Sarah was just starting to lose that little kid clumsiness when... He stopped, swallowed hard. "When I lost them both." Lena had stopped shaking, listening to this story she'd never heard him speak aloud before. "I wasn't there when they died," Elias continued. "I was off fighting someone else's war while my family got sick and died. Came home to find them already buried, the house sold, everything gone. That's when I came to the mountain. Couldn't stand being around people, around life continuing like nothing had happened. Up here, at least the world matched how I felt inside. Cold, empty, dead." He looked at Lena then, really looked at her. "But you changed that. You brought life back. Purpose. Made me remember that surviving and living aren't the same thing." His voice roughened. "So when you have nightmares, when the past comes back and makes you scared, I understand. I got nightmares too. But we're both still here, both still fighting to live instead of just survive. And that's worth something. Lena's hand emerged from under the quilts, reaching toward him. Elias took it carefully, his large, scarred hand completely engulfing her small one. "We'll get through it," he said, "together. That's how it works now." February arrived with slightly longer days and no lessening of the cold. But the worst of the winter storms seemed to have passed, and there were occasional breaks of brilliant sunshine that made the snow sparkle like diamonds and lifted everyone's spirits. Elias started teaching Lena more complex skills. He showed her how to preserve meat, how to repair boots and clothes, how to make soap from wood ash and fat. He taught her to identify different trees by their bark and shape, to read animal tracks in the snow, to find north by the position of the sun and stars. "These skills make you valuable," he told her one afternoon as they worked on preparing hides. "Not to other people necessarily, but to yourself. Makes you independent. Nobody can take that away once you've learned it." Lena watched his hands work the leather and tried to match his movements. She was getting better at everything. Her hands were steadier, her movements more confident. The frightened broken child who'd stood on the auction block was slowly being replaced by someone stronger. One evening in late February, they were sitting by the fire as usual when Lena picked up her pencil and wrote something she'd been thinking about for weeks. What happens in the spring, when the snow melts and people can come up the mountain again? Elias read the question and was quiet for a long time. When he finally responded in writing, his letters were careful and deliberate. "Nothing changes. You live here. This is your home, unless you want something different?" Lena wrote quickly, "No, I want to stay. But what if they try to take me away? The town people?" Elias's jaw tightened. He wrote, "I paid legal money for your guardianship, got witnesses. Unless someone can prove I'm unfit or you're in danger, they can't just take you. But if someone makes trouble, we'll deal with it. Together." The word "together" made something warm bloom in Lena's chest. She wrote, "Are you my father now?" Elias stared at those words for a very long time. His hand trembled slightly as he picked up the pencil. "If you want me to be. Not replacing your real father. Nobody could do that. But I could be something like that. If you're willing." Lena didn't hesitate. She wrote in large, firm letters, "Yes." When Elias read that, his eyes went suspiciously bright. He cleared his throat roughly and wrote, "Then that's settled. You're my daughter, far as I'm concerned. Family by choice, which is maybe stronger than family by blood." They sat together in the firelight, this makeshift family of broken pieces, and felt something shift into place. They belonged to each other now. It was official, at least between them. But that peace wouldn't last. Because 3 days later, as March crept closer and the first signs of thaw began to show, they heard the sound of horses and voices carrying up the mountain. Company was coming, whether they wanted it or not, and everything they'd built in their quiet isolation was about to be tested. Elias moved to the window and looked out at the figures making their way up the trail on horseback, their silhouettes dark against the snow. "We've got visitors," he said quietly. "Official-looking ones." Lena joined him at the window, her heart hammering. She recognized the lead rider even from a distance, Sheriff Dalton from Stillwater. Behind him rode 2 other men, one wearing what looked like a territorial badge, the other dressed in a city suit that seemed absurdly out of place in the mountain wilderness. "Stay calm," Elias said, though tension had crept into his voice. "We haven't done anything wrong. This is just people being people, suspicious and meddling." He looked down at her. "But Lena, if they ask you questions, you don't have to answer. Not in writing, not anyway, you understand? You're a child. You don't owe them explanations." Lena nodded, but fear had wrapped itself around her lungs. She'd known this was coming eventually, known that the town wouldn't just forget about her, wouldn't just let Elias keep her without interference. But knowing and experiencing were different things. The riders reached the clearing and dismounted. Elias opened the door before they could knock, his large frame filling the doorway in a way that was clearly deliberate. "Sheriff," he said evenly, "this is unexpected." "Elias." Dalton had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Sorry to intrude. This is Territorial Child Welfare Officer Marcus Webb and District Administrator Harold Finch. They've got some questions about the girl." The man in the suit stepped forward, his thin face pinched with cold and something that looked like predetermined judgment. "Mr. Creed, I'm Administrator Finch. We've received complaints regarding your guardianship of the minor child purchased at auction last September. I'm here to investigate the situation and determine if removal is necessary. Elias didn't move from the doorway. Removal, he repeated, his voice gone dangerously quiet. On what grounds? On the grounds that a single man living in isolation with a young girl is inappropriate at best and potentially dangerous at worst, Finch said primly. The child should be in a proper family setting, preferably with a married couple, in town where she can attend school and receive proper supervision. She receives plenty of supervision here, education too, and she's safe and cared for. That's what we're here to determine, the territorial officer, Webb, said. He was younger than Finch, maybe 30, with a weathered face that suggested frontier experience. Mr. Creed, nobody's accusing you of wrongdoing, but you have to understand how this looks. We need to verify the child's well-being. Elias stood silent for a long moment, clearly wrestling with his temper. Finally, he stepped back. Come in then. But you keep it civil and you keep it brief. Lena's been through enough without strangers interrogating her. The three men entered the cabin, and their eyes immediately went to where Lena stood by the fire, trying to look brave and failing. She wore one of the dresses Emma had made. Her hair was clean and neatly braided, and she looked healthy and well-fed, nothing like the hollow-eyed ghost child from the auction block. Webb's expression softened slightly. Finch's remained skeptical. Hello, child, Finch said in the condescending tone adults used with stupid children. Do you know who I am? Lena just stared at him, her face carefully blank. She doesn't talk, Elias said flatly. Hasn't since her parents died, but she understands everything you say. How convenient, Finch murmured, and Elias's hands clenched into fists. Sheriff Dalton stepped between them quickly. Now hold on, Harold. The girl's condition is documented from before Elias ever took her. The church ladies can confirm it. Then how do you communicate with her? Finch demanded, looking at Elias. How do you know what she wants or needs? She writes, Elias said. I taught her. She reads and writes better than half the adults in Stillwater. How fortunate that the only witness to your treatment of her communicates through a method you taught her and control. Finch's implication was clear and ugly. Webb winced. Mr. Finch, I don't think... I'd like to see the child's living quarters, Finch interrupted. And I'll need to speak with her privately. Like hell you will, Elias growled. Mr. Creed, I can return with a federal marshal if you prefer, Finch said coldly. But one way or another, I will verify this child's safety. Now you can cooperate, or you can make this much harder than it needs to be. The cabin fell silent except for the crackling fire. Lena could feel the tension like a living thing, could see the way Elias's shoulders were rigid, the way his jaw was locked so tight the muscles jumped. He was seconds from throwing these men out bodily, she realized, seconds from doing something that would give them exactly the excuse they needed to take her away. She couldn't let that happen. Before she fully thought through what she was doing, Lena walked across the room and took Elias's hand. Then she looked directly at the administrator and did something she hadn't done since the wagon accident. She spoke. The word came out rusty and strange after 7 months of silence, but it was clear enough. No. Every person in the cabin froze. Elias looked down at her in shock. The three visitors stared like they'd just witnessed a miracle. What did you say? Webb stammered. Lena swallowed hard and tried again. Her voice was barely a whisper, but in the sudden silence it carried clearly. He's good. He's kind. Don't take me away. The silence that followed Lena's words was so complete that the crackling of the fire sounded like gunshots. Administrator Finch's face had gone pale, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. Webb stared at Lena with something approaching wonder. Sheriff Dalton let out a long, slow breath. Elias's hand tightened around Lena's, and when she looked up at him, his eyes were shining with emotion he didn't try to hide. The child speaks, Finch finally managed, his voice strangled. After months of silence, she speaks the moment I arrive to investigate. She speaks because she wants to, Elias said, his voice rough. Because she's got something important enough to say that it's worth breaking her silence. You going to listen, or you going to keep implying things you can't prove? Finch straightened his coat, trying to recover his composure. Miss, what is your name, child? Lena, she whispered, the word coming easier this time. Lena Hart. And you claim Mr. Creed has treated you well? He saved me. The words were gaining strength, fed by the anger building in her small chest. Nobody wanted me. They looked at me like I was broken, like I was nothing. Her fingers squeezed Elias's hand. He gave me a home. He's teaching me things. He's never hurt me, never scared me, never made me feel small. Her dark eyes blazed with an intensity that made Finch take a step backward. He's the only person who's been good to me since my parents died. Webb cleared his throat. Lena, I know this is difficult, but we need to ask you some questions, just to make sure everything is as it should be. Can you show us your room? Lena hesitated, looking up at Elias. He nodded slightly, giving permission. She released his hand and walked to her bedroom door, pushing it open. The three men crowded in the doorway, and even Finch couldn't hide his surprise. The room was small but immaculate. The bed was neatly made with clean quilts. The dresser held her carved treasure box, her books, the wooden rocking horse. The rag dolls, both Emma's and Elias's crude attempt, sat propped against the pillow. The window had real glass and curtains made from the extra fabric from her dresses. On the wall hung a small mirror and a slate board with chalk for practicing letters. It was a child's room, a love child's room. She has her own space, Webb said quietly, making notes in a small book. Clean bedding, adequate heating from the main fireplace, educational materials, personal belongings. Where does Mr. Creed sleep? Finch asked sharply. In his own room, Lena said, pointing across the main room to Elias's closed door. He never comes in here unless I have nightmares. Then he sits in the chair until I fall asleep. Nightmares, Finch pounced on the word. About what? About the wagon accident that killed my parents. Lena's voice dropped to barely a whisper. About being alone. About being unwanted. She lifted her chin. But I'm not alone anymore. And I'm not unwanted. Not here. Webb moved through the cabin, examining everything with a thorough professionalism that was somehow less invasive than Finch's suspicious hostility. He looked in the root cellar stocked with food, the shelves lined with preserves and dried goods, the clean kitchen area with its well-maintained stove and orderly supplies. He examined the books on the shelf, the writing materials, the evidence of a life being lived with care and purpose. The child appears healthy, he said, returning to the main room. Well-fed, properly clothed, clean, educated. The living conditions are better than many I've seen in town. Mr. Creed, you've clearly made an effort to provide for her needs. I've done what any decent person would do, Elias said flatly. Finch wasn't ready to concede defeat. Physical needs are one thing, but what about moral guidance? Social development? The child is isolated up here with no female influence, no contact with other children, no exposure to proper society. I see Emma Morrison regular, Lena spoke up. She teaches me sewing and tells me about town. And proper society is what put me on an auction block like I was a cow. I don't need that kind of proper. Sheriff Dalton coughed to hide what might have been a laugh. Even Webb's mouth twitched. Finch's face flushed red. Young lady, you don't understand the complexities of... I understand plenty. Lena's voice grew stronger with each word, fed by months of silent observation and careful thought. I understand that all those good people in Stillwater with their proper families and their proper society, let me stand on that platform and nobody bid a single dollar, not one. They were going to send me to the territorial orphanage where kids disappear and nobody asks questions. But Elias paid $500, more money than most people see in a year, just to give me a chance. She paused, breathing hard. So don't talk to me about proper. Proper is what failed me. Elias is what saved me. The cabin fell silent again. Finch looked like he'd been slapped. Webb was writing furiously in his notebook. Dalton studied his boots with intense interest. The child is clearly articulate and intelligent, Webb said finally, and passionate in her defense of her guardian. Mr. Finch, I'm not seeing evidence of mistreatment or neglect. In fact, I'm seeing quite the opposite. The situation is still irregular, Finch insisted, but his voice had lost its aggressive edge. A single man, a child, living in isolation, is legal, Elias cut him off. I paid the auction price in full. I've got witnesses to the transaction. I'm providing food, shelter, education, and safety. Unless you can prove actual harm or danger, You've got no grounds to remove her. There's also the matter of your background, Mr. Creed. Finch pulled a folder from his satchel. I've done some research. You served in the cavalry, correct? Saw action in several conflicts? Were present at the massacre at... Don't. Elias's voice went deadly quiet. Don't you dare bring that up in front of her. The public has a right to know if a child is being cared for by someone with a violent past. My past is my own business. I was a soldier. I did what soldiers do. I took my wounds and my discharge, and I came home to bury my family. Then I came here to live in peace. Elias's hands were shaking now. Whether from rage or old pain, it was impossible to tell. You want to judge me for things I did in uniform, for orders I followed, for trying to survive in places you can't even imagine. Go ahead. But don't pretend it has anything to do with how I treat this child. It speaks to character, Finch said primly. Then let me speak to character. Webb closed his notebook and looked directly at Finch. I've interviewed the child. I've examined the living conditions. I've reviewed the legal documentation of the adoption. Yes, Mr. Creed, I did my homework too. Everything is in order. The child is safe, healthy, educated, and clearly cared for. More than that, she's thriving in ways she wasn't in Stillwater. He paused. I'm recommending that guardianship remain with Mr. Creed, with a follow-up visit in 6 months to verify continued welfare. Finch's face went purple. That's not your decision alone to make. I have the authority to... You have the authority to investigate, Webb interrupted, which you've done. I have the authority to make recommendations based on the child's best interests, which I'm doing. If you want to override me, you'll need to take it up with the territorial governor, and I'll be submitting my full report, including testimony from the child herself, which I don't think will support your position. Lena felt dizzy with relief. Elias's hand found hers again, squeezing gently. This isn't over, Finch said, gathering his papers with sharp, angry movements. I'll be filing a formal complaint with the territorial office. The situation is inappropriate regardless of your findings, Mr. Webb. File whatever you want, Webb said calmly. But unless something changes dramatically, my recommendation stands. Finch stormed out of the cabin, mounting his horse with jerky, offended movements. Webb lingered a moment longer. Mr. Creed, a word of advice, he said quietly. Get the guardianship formalized properly. Right now, you've got an auction receipt, which is legally questionable at best. Go through the territorial court, get official papers drawn up. It'll protect both of you if Finch decides to make more trouble. How do I do that? Elias asked. Come to the territorial office in Helena when the pass clears in spring. Bring the child, bring witnesses who can testify to her welfare, bring documentation of the auction. I'll help you navigate the process. Webb glanced at Lena. You did a brave thing today, speaking up. That took real courage. I wasn't going to let him take me away, Lena said simply. After the men left, the cabin felt larger somehow, like a pressure had been released. Elias stood at the window watching them disappear down the mountain trail, his shoulders tight with tension that wouldn't ease until they were completely out of sight. Lena walked up beside him. Are you angry that I talked? Elias looked down at her, and his expression was tender in a way she'd never seen before. Angry? No, sweetheart. I'm proud and grateful, and maybe a little awed that you found your voice when it mattered most. I couldn't let them take me, she said again. This is home. She paused, searching for the right word. You're my father now. That's what we decided. And I wasn't going to let some mean man in a suit change that. Elias knelt down so they were eye level, his scarred hands gentle on her shoulders. You understand what this means, don't you? You breaking your silence? They'll expect you to talk now. People will ask questions, want conversations. It's going to be harder to hide. I don't want to hide anymore, Lena said, and realized it was true. I was quiet because I was scared, and nobody cared what I had to say anyway. But you care. Emma cares. And those men needed to hear the truth. She paused. I might not talk all the time. Sometimes it's still easier to write, but I can talk when I need to, when it matters. That's fair enough. Elias pulled her into a hug, and Lena wrapped her arms around his neck and held on tight. They stayed like that for a long moment, this makeshift family that had fought for the right to exist. When they finally pulled apart, Elias said, We need to do what Webb suggested. Get proper legal papers. That means a trip to Helena come spring. Will they try to take me away there too? Not if I can help it. And now that you can speak for yourself, they'll have a harder time arguing against your wishes. He stood, his bad leg protesting the movement. But it means leaving the mountain, going into the city, being around lots of people. You think you can handle that? Lena thought about it. The idea of crowds and noise and strangers made her stomach clench. But the alternative, losing this home, this safety, this man who'd given her everything, was worse. I can handle it, if you're with me. Always, Elias said firmly. We're in this together now. Family. The words settled over them like a blessing. The rest of March passed in a blur of preparation. The snow began its slow retreat, revealing the brown grass and muddy earth beneath. The creek swelled with meltwater, running fast and cold. The days grew noticeably longer, and the birds returned. First the crows and ravens, then the smaller songbirds whose calls filled the forest with music Lena had missed through the long silence of winter. Elias began teaching Lena to speak regularly, encouraging her to use her voice for simple things, reading aloud from books, naming objects around the cabin, practicing conversations that might be needed in Helena. Her voice was rusty from disuse, sometimes cracking or fading to a whisper, but it grew stronger with practice. The judge will want to hear from you directly, Elias explained one evening as they worked through reading practice. He'll ask if you want to stay here, if you feel safe, if you're being cared for properly. You need to be able to answer clearly. I can do that, Lena said, her voice more confident now. I'll tell them the truth, that you're the best father I could ask for. Elias's expression went soft. I'm not trying to replace your real father. Want to make sure you know that. I know. But he's gone, and you're here. And you chose me when nobody else would. Lena set down her book. That makes you real enough. Emma Morrison made her first visit since winter, arriving on a warm April morning when the snow had finally retreated enough to make the trail passable. She brought fresh eggs, early greens from her mother's greenhouse, and news from the valley. The whole territory's talking about you two, she said, settling at the table with coffee. Some folks are saying Lena's speaking is a miracle. Others are saying Elias must have been coaching her all winter, teaching her what to say. She rolled her eyes. People will gossip about anything. Let them talk, Elias said. We know the truth. The truth being that you're both stubborn as mules and twice as determined. Emma grinned at Lena. You caused quite a stir speaking up like that. Administrator Finch is apparently still complaining to anyone who'll listen, but Webb's report was glowing. Said he'd never seen a better cared-for child in an unconventional situation. What's Helena like? Lena asked, voicing the question that had been worrying her for weeks. Emma considered. Big, loud, lots of buildings and people and activity. The territorial office is impressive, all marble and official looking. It can be overwhelming if you're not used to cities. She looked at Lena's anxious face. But you'll have Elias with you. And honestly, after standing up to Finch, a judge should be easy. They spent the afternoon in easy companionship. Emma showed Lena how to plant early vegetables, peas and lettuce that could tolerate cool weather. Elias and Emma's father, who'd accompanied her up the mountain, worked on repairs to the barn roof damaged by winter ice. As the Morrisons were preparing to leave, Emma pulled Lena aside. I know you're nervous about Helena, but remember something, you survived losing your parents. You survived Stillwater. You survived a whole winter on this mountain. You're tougher than you think. She hugged Lena tight. And if anyone tries to take you away from Elias, they'll have to go through all of us. The whole Morrison family thinks what you two have is special. We'll testify to that if needed. The support meant more than Lena could express. She watched the Morrisons ride away, waving until they disappeared into the trees, and felt a little less alone in the world. May arrived with an explosion of life. Wildflowers carpeted the mountain meadows in purple and yellow. The aspens leafed out in brilliant green. Deer appeared in the clearing at dawn and dusk, and Lena learned to move quietly enough to watch them without causing flight. The garden that Emma had helped plant began to sprout, tiny green shoots pushing through dark soil. Elias became increasingly focused on the upcoming trip to Helena. He made lists of documents to bring, rehearsed questions the judge might ask, prepared Lena for every scenario he could imagine. What if they ask why you want to stay with me? He'd say during their evening lessons. Because you're kind, and you keep me safe, and you're teaching me to be strong instead of just telling me to be quiet, Lena would respond, the words coming more easily each time. What if they ask if you're scared of me? I'll tell them the only thing I'm scared of is losing my home, that you've never given me reason to fear you, only reasons to trust you. They practiced until the responses felt natural, until Lena could speak clearly and confidently about her life on the mountain and her desire to stay. But underneath the preparation was an undercurrent of anxiety they both felt but rarely acknowledged. What if the judge didn't agree? What if Finch's complaints carried more weight than Webb's recommendation? What if Lena's voice and Elias's character weren't enough to overcome society's judgment about what a proper family should look like? The night before they were scheduled to leave for Helena, Lena couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed watching moonlight paint silver patterns on her ceiling and thinking about all the things that could go wrong. Eventually, she got up and padded into the main room. Elias sat in his chair by the dying fire, not reading, just staring into the embers. He looked up when she appeared. "Can't sleep either?" he asked quietly. Lena shook her head and climbed into the other rocking chair, pulling a quilt around her shoulders. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the settling of coals and the distant call of an owl. "I'm scared," Lena finally admitted. "What if it's not enough? What if they take me anyway?" "Then we fight harder," Elias said firmly. "We get lawyers if we need to. We appeal to higher courts. We don't give up." He paused. "But Lena, I don't think it'll come to that. You're smart and brave and you know your own mind. When that judge hears you speak, when he sees how determined you are, he'll understand." "How do you know?" "Because any fool can see we belong together. You saved me as much as I saved you, maybe more." Elias's voice went rough. "Before you came, I was just existing, going through motions, waiting to die, really, even if I didn't admit it. But you gave me purpose again, made me remember what it feels like to care about someone, to want to build a future instead of just surviving the present." Lena felt tears prick her eyes. "You gave me that too. A future, hope, a reason to use my voice again." "Then we'll make sure that Judge understands what we mean to each other. And if he doesn't, well, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it." They sat together until the fire died completely and the cabin grew cold. Then Elias banked the coals, checked the doors, and walked Lena back to her room. "Get some sleep," he said gently. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day, but we'll face it together, just like everything else." Lena climbed into bed and Elias pulled the quilts up around her shoulders, a gesture that had become routine over the months, this small act of care that said more than words could. "Elias?" she said as he turned to leave. "Yeah? Thank you. For everything. For seeing me when nobody else did. For fighting for me. For being my father." His silhouette in the doorway went very still. Then he said, his voice thick with emotion, "You're welcome, daughter. Now sleep. We've got a battle to win tomorrow." He closed the door softly, and Lena lay in the darkness feeling strangely calm despite her earlier anxiety. Whatever happened in Helena, whatever the judge decided, she knew one fundamental truth. She was loved. She was wanted. She mattered to someone who would fight for her. That knowledge was armor against whatever tomorrow might bring. Morning came gray and cool, with clouds promising rain later in the day. Elias and Lena dressed in their best clothes. For him, a clean shirt and his only suit coat, somewhat worn but respectable. For Lena, the blue dress Emma had made, carefully pressed and paired with a knitted shawl. They looked like what they were, mountain people trying to present themselves as civilized, as worthy, as deserving of the law's approval. The wagon ride down the mountain took most of the morning. The trail was muddy from snowmelt, and the horses had to pick their way carefully around washouts and fallen branches. Lena sat beside Elias on the driver's bench, clutching the small bag that held her important papers. Her parents' wedding certificate, her birth record, the auction receipt that served as proof of Elias's guardianship. As they descended, the forest gradually gave way to farmland and scattered settlements. More people appeared, working fields, mending fences, going about the business of ordinary life. Lena hadn't seen this many people since the auction, and the noise and activity made her shrink closer to Elias. "You're doing fine," he murmured, keeping the horses to a steady pace. "Just remember, we belong to each other. Nobody can change that unless we let them. They reached Stillwater by early afternoon and stopped briefly to collect Emma Morrison, who'd ridden down earlier to serve as a character witness. She climbed into the wagon wearing her Sunday dress and a determined expression. "Ready to make some territorial officials regret underestimating mountain folk?" she asked cheerfully. "Ready as we'll ever be," Elias replied. The final leg to Helena took another 3 hours. The capital city rose out of the valley like something from another world. Multi-story buildings, paved streets, telegraph wires strung between poles. People everywhere moving with the purposeful energy of commerce and government. The noise was overwhelming after months of mountain silence. Wagon wheels on cobblestones, vendors calling their wares, dogs barking, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer. 100 conversations happening simultaneously. Lena pressed against Elias's side, her eyes wide with anxiety. This was civilization, proper society, the world that had rejected her once before. Would it reject her again? "Almost there," Elias said quietly. "The territorial office is just ahead. Once we're inside, it'll be quieter. You can do this, Lena. I know you can." The Territorial Administration Building was exactly as Emma had described. Imposing gray stone with marble columns and broad steps leading to heavy wooden doors. They tied the horses at a public hitching post and climbed the steps together, their boots echoing on the stone. Inside, a clerk directed them to the 3rd floor, to the office of Judge Samuel Morrison. No relation to Emma's family, just an unfortunate coincidence. They climbed the stairs slowly, Elias's bad leg making the ascent difficult, and found themselves in a waiting area with wooden benches and official-looking documents framed on the walls. A secretary looked up from her desk. "Names?" "Elias Creed and Lena Hart," Elias said. "We have an appointment regarding guardianship formalization." The secretary consulted her ledger. "Yes, Officer Webb mentioned you'd be coming. The judge is finishing with another matter. Please wait here." They sat on the hard bench, the 3 of them in a row, and waited. The minutes crawled past. Other people came and went. Men in suits, women in fine dresses, all looking prosperous and confident and like they belonged in this world of marble and authority. Lena felt very small and very out of place. She studied her worn boots and tried to remember all the things she'd practiced saying. But the words felt slippery now, uncertain, like they might fail her when she needed them most. Elias seemed to sense her growing panic. He reached over and took her hand, his calloused palm warm and steady against hers. "Breathe," he said quietly. "You've got this. We've got this." Emma leaned in from the other side. "Remember what I said. You're tougher than you think, and you're not alone." The secretary's voice cut through their quiet encouragement. "The judge will see you now." They stood together and walked through the heavy oak door into Judge Morrison's chambers, ready to fight for the right to remain a family. Judge Samuel Morrison's chambers were smaller than Lena expected, but no less intimidating. Dark wood paneling covered the walls, lined with law books whose leather spines bore gold lettering. A large desk dominated the space, its surface covered with neat stacks of papers and official seals. Behind it sat the judge himself, a man of perhaps 60 with silver hair, wire-rimmed spectacles, and a face that revealed nothing of his thoughts. He studied them over the top of his glasses as they entered. Officer Webb stood to one side of the room, his notebook already open, and in the corner, looking supremely dissatisfied, sat Administrator Finch. "Mr. Creed, Miss Hart, Miss Morrison," the judge said, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to being listened to. "Please sit." 3 chairs had been arranged facing the desk. They settled into them, and Lena felt Elias's hand find hers beneath the line of sight, offering silent support. Judge Morrison shuffled through papers on his desk. "I've reviewed Officer Webb's report regarding the welfare investigation conducted in March. I've also read Administrator Finch's formal complaint and his subsequent documentation." He looked up. "This is an unusual situation. A single man purchasing a child at auction, providing guardianship in isolation, with no female presence in the household and no oversight from established child welfare institutions. Mr. Finch has raised valid concerns about propriety and proper supervision." Lena's stomach dropped. This wasn't starting the way they'd hoped. "However," the judge continued, "Officer Webb's observations paint a very different picture. A well-cared-for child, adequate living conditions, educational opportunities, and most remarkably, a child who found her voice after months of selective mutism in order to defend her guardian. He removed his glasses and looked directly at Lena. That speaks to something beyond mere adequacy. That speaks to attachment, to trust, to feeling safe enough to be vulnerable. Your Honor, if I may, Finch interrupted, standing, the child's testimony is not reliable. She's been isolated with Mr. Creed for months. She's been dependent on him for everything, food, shelter, warmth. Of course she'd defend him. It's a form of survival adaptation, not genuine. Mr. Finch, I've been a judge for 23 years, Morrison said mildly. I've seen frightened children, coerced children, traumatized children who'll say anything their abusers want them to say. I've also read Webb's report 3 times now. The child wasn't just defending Mr. Creed. She was articulating specific reasons why her life improved in his care. She showed emotional intelligence and awareness well beyond manipulation or coaching. He turned to Lena. Miss Hart, I'd like to hear from you directly. Are you comfortable speaking in front of all these adults? Lena swallowed hard. Her mouth felt dry, and her prepared words had scattered like leaves in wind. But Elias's hand squeezed hers gently, and she found her voice. Yes, sir, I can speak. Good. Then tell me in your own words what your life was like before Mr. Creed became your guardian. This was the question she'd practiced, but sitting in this formal chamber with all these powerful adults watching, the answers felt different, more important. She took a breath and began. My parents died in a wagon accident 7 months before the auction. I was the only one who survived, and I don't really remember how. When I woke up, they were gone, and I was in Stillwater with people I didn't know. Her voice shook slightly but held. The church ladies took me in, but they didn't want me. I could tell. I was a burden, something they had to tolerate because it was the right thing to do, not because they cared. Did they mistreat you? The judge asked gently. Not exactly. They fed me and gave me a place to sleep, but they talked about me like I wasn't there, like I was broken furniture they couldn't fix. And the other children, she paused, remembering the thrown stones and whispered names. They called me Ghost Girl, said I was cursed, said that's why my parents died and I didn't. Emma made a small, angry sound. Even the judge's expression tightened. I stopped talking because nobody listened anyway, Lena continued. Words didn't help anything. Being quiet meant being invisible, and invisible meant safer. So I just stopped. For 6 months, I didn't say a word to anyone. And then the auction, the judge prompted. They put me on a platform in the town square, next to lumber and a broken clock. The auctioneer said I was healthy and quiet and wouldn't cost much to feed, like I was livestock. The memory still stung, even months later. All those people stood there and looked everywhere except at me. Nobody wanted me. Nobody bid even $5. She glanced at Elias, whose jaw was tight with old anger at the memory. Then Elias came. Everyone got scared because of his reputation. The hermit from the mountain, the dangerous man. But he looked at me different than everyone else did. Not like I was broken or cursed or unwanted, just like I was a person who deserved better. Her voice grew stronger. He bid $500, more money than anyone expected. And when he took me up that mountain, I was terrified because I didn't know what he wanted from me. Everyone in town had whispered that he must have bad intentions. And did he? Judge Morrison asked quietly. No, sir. He gave me my own room. He taught me to read better and to write. He showed me how to do things. Feed chickens, card wool, preserve food, survive in the mountains. He never asked me to earn my place there. Never made me feel like I owed him something. Lena's eyes were bright now. He fixed a rocking horse that belonged to his daughter, who died, and he gave it to me because he thought I might like it. He sat with me when I had nightmares. He taught me that being strong doesn't mean not being scared. It means doing hard things even when you're scared. The room was completely silent except for the scratch of Webb's pencil taking notes. When those men came in March to investigate, Lena continued, Administrator Finch talked like I was property that might be stolen or damaged. But I'm not property. I'm a person, and I have the right to say where I want to live and who I want to live with. She looked directly at the judge. I want to stay with Elias. He's the only father I have now. He's my family, and taking me away from him would be cruel, crueler than anything that's happened to me so far. Judge Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to Elias. Mr. Creed, you served in the cavalry, is that correct? Yes, sir. 6th Cavalry, 12 years. Took my discharge after... He paused. After my family died while I was deployed. And your wife and daughter died of fever? Scarlet fever, sir. Swept through their town while I was on campaign. By the time I got word and made it home, they'd been buried 3 weeks. The judge's expression softened slightly. That must have been devastating. It was, sir. Broke something in me that I thought wouldn't ever heal. That's why I came to the mountain. Couldn't stand being around people living normal lives when mine had ended. What changed? Elias looked at Lena. She did. Made me realize that surviving and living are different things. That maybe I still had something to offer. That maybe broken things can be useful for helping other broken things heal. Mr. Creed, do you understand the concerns that have been raised? A single man, a young girl, living in isolation? It creates an appearance of impropriety regardless of the reality. I understand appearances, sir. I also understand that appearances condemn this child to standing on an auction block, while good, proper, married couples with fine reputations walked right past her. Elias's voice was respectful but firm. If I'd been a married man with a wife and a nice house in town, nobody would question my taking her in. But I'm not. I'm a widower with a mountain cabin and a past that scares people. That doesn't make me unfit. It just makes me different from what society expects. Your Honor, this is precisely the point, Finch interjected. The situation is irregular. Regardless of Mr. Creed's intentions, we must consider propriety and... Mr. Finch, I'm going to stop you there. Judge Morrison's voice carried a note of steel. I've listened to your concerns. I've read your documentation, and I'm going to be frank with you. Your complaint seems less concerned with this child's actual welfare and more concerned with adherence to social conventions. Social conventions exist for good reason, Finch said stiffly. Sometimes they do. Other times they're just excuses for small-minded people to enforce conformity. The judge turned to Emma. Miss Morrison, you've been a regular visitor to the Creed household. What can you tell me about Miss Hart's life there? Emma sat up straighter. I've known Elias Creed for 5 years, Your Honor. He's been our family's neighbor and friend. He's quiet and keeps to himself, but he's honest and decent and hardworking. When Lena came to live with him, I was curious how it would work. I'll admit that. But every time I visit, I see the same thing. A man teaching a child skills that'll make her independent and strong. A child who's learning to trust again, to laugh again, to believe she has worth. Emma's voice was passionate. I've got 3 brothers, Your Honor. I know what healthy family dynamics look like. And I see that on Elias's mountain. Maybe it's not conventional, but it's real and it's good. Has Miss Hart ever seemed frightened of Mr. Creed? Never. Not once. She follows him around like a duckling following a mother duck, watching everything he does, learning from him. And he's patient with her in ways I've rarely seen. He treats her like she's precious, like she matters. That's what every child deserves. The judge made notes, then looked back at Lena. Miss Hart, if I were to grant permanent guardianship to Mr. Creed, you understand that means he would have legal authority over you until you reach adulthood? He would make decisions about your education, your welfare, where you live. You'd be bound to his household. I understand, sir. That's what I want. And if circumstances change, if he remarries, or if you find living on the mountain too isolated as you grow older, then we'll figure it out together. That's what families do. Lena's voice was steady now, certain. But right now, today, I want to stay with him. I need to stay with him. He's the only safe place I've found since my parents died. Judge Morrison removed his glasses and cleaned them thoughtfully. The silence stretched until Lena thought she might scream from tension. Finally, the judge spoke. I'm going to be honest with all of you. This case troubles me. Not because I see evidence of mistreatment or neglect. Officer Webb's report is clear on that account, and Miss Hart's testimony confirms it. What troubles me is the precedent it sets. If I approve this unconventional arrangement, others might attempt to exploit it. Single men claiming guardianship of vulnerable children without proper oversight. Lena's heart sank. Elias's hand tightened around hers. However, the judge continued, the law is meant to serve the best interests of the child, not to enforce social conventions or protect theoretical future problems. And in this case, the child's best interest seems clear. Miss Hart is thriving in Mr. Creed's care in ways she didn't in Stillwater's more conventional setting. He picked up his pen and pulled a document forward. I'm prepared to grant permanent guardianship with conditions. First, Mr. Creed, you will ensure Miss Hart receives regular education. If she cannot attend school in town, you will provide tutoring or arrange for distance education through the territorial system. Second, Officer Webb will conduct annual welfare visits until Miss Hart reaches the age of 12. Third, should Miss Hart at any point express desire to change her living situation, this guardianship can be revisited. Are these terms acceptable? Yes, sir, Elias said immediately. More than acceptable. Then I'll sign the papers. Miss Hart will legally become your ward, and you'll have full parental authority and responsibility. The judge began signing documents, his pen scratching across official paper. Mr. Finch, your concerns are noted for the record, but I find them insufficient to overcome the clear evidence of this child's well-being and her own stated preference. Finch's face flushed with anger, but he said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The judge had ruled. When Morrison finished signing, he looked up at Lena with something approaching kindness. Miss Hart, you're a remarkably brave young woman. What you did, finding your voice to defend your home and your family, that took courage most adults don't possess. I hope you continue to speak up, to advocate for yourself, to never again let anyone make you feel small or invisible. Thank you, sir, Lena managed, her voice thick with emotion. Mr. Creed, you've taken on a significant responsibility. Raising a child alone is never easy, especially a child who's experienced trauma. But I believe you understand that. I believe you'll do right by her. I will, Your Honor. You have my word. They left the judge's chambers in a daze. The hallway seemed too bright, the sounds too loud. Lena felt Elias's hand on her shoulder, steady and real, grounding her to this moment. We won, Emma said, her voice jubilant. You actually won. We told the truth, Elias corrected quietly. The judge just had the wisdom to see it. They collected copies of the signed guardianship papers from the secretary, and Lena stared at the official document with its seals and signatures. It made everything real, legal, permanent. She was Elias Creed's daughter now, recognized by law and territory. They were walking toward the stairs when a voice called out behind them. Mr. Creed, wait. They turned to find a woman approaching, middle-aged, well-dressed in traveling clothes, with dark hair and eyes that looked strangely familiar. She carried herself with the confidence of education and means, but her expression was tentative, almost nervous. I apologize for the intrusion, she said, stopping a respectful distance away. My name is Vivian Hale. I've just arrived from Boston, and I was directed here by the territorial office. I'm looking for information about a child named Lena Hart. The world seemed to tilt. Lena pressed closer to Elias, sudden fear clawing at her chest. Who was this woman? What did she want? Elias's voice was wary. Why are you looking for her? Vivian's gaze found Lena, and something complicated crossed her face. Recognition, grief, longing. Because I believe she's my niece. My sister Margaret's daughter. The words hit like a physical blow. Lena's mother had been named Margaret. She'd had a sister back east, someone she'd mentioned occasionally but hadn't seen in years. But that sister had never written, never visited, never acknowledged Lena's existence after the accident. You're Margaret's sister? Elias asked, his tone flat. Yes. I received word of her death only 3 weeks ago. The letter had been delayed, rerouted several times. I came as quickly as I could. Vivian's voice shook slightly. I was told my niece had been placed with a guardian after an auction in Stillwater. I've been searching for information about what happened to her. What do you want? Elias asked bluntly. Vivian straightened her shoulders. I want to meet her, to see that she's all right. And if possible, she paused, choosing her words carefully. I'd like to offer her a home. I'm unmarried, but financially secure. I have a house in Boston with staff, connections to excellent schools. I can provide opportunities that a frontier life never could. Education, culture, society, a future beyond. She gestured vaguely at their mountain clothes, their rough appearance. Beyond this, Emma made an outraged sound. Officer Webb, who'd followed them out and overheard the conversation, looked uncomfortable. Elias's face went dangerously still. But it was Lena who spoke, her voice cutting through the shocked silence. You're my mother's sister? Aunt Vivian? Yes, child. Your mother and I had a falling out years ago when she married your father against our family's wishes. I said things I shouldn't have, did things I regret. But she was still my sister, and you're still my blood. Vivian took a step closer. I want to make amends, to give you the life Margaret would have wanted for you. My mother wanted me to be happy, Lena said, and there was steel in her young voice. She wanted me to be loved and safe. She got both those things with my father, even if your family didn't approve of him, and I have both those things now with Elias. You're a child living in isolation with a stranger. How can you possibly understand what's best for... He's not a stranger, he's my father. Lena's voice rose. And I just spent an hour in front of a territorial judge fighting for the right to stay with him. The papers are signed. It's legal, and it's final, and it's what I want. Vivian's face crumpled slightly. Please, just listen. I'm not trying to take you away against your will, but you should know what options you have. In Boston, you could attend the finest schools. You could have music lessons, art instruction, proper society. You could become anything you want, a teacher, a writer, whatever dreams you have. Here, you'll be limited to whatever this frontier life offers. I'll be free, Lena said simply. Free to be myself. Free from people who judge me based on appearances or gossip or social conventions. Free to learn things that matter, how to survive, how to be strong, how to stand up for what I believe in. She looked at this stranger who shared her mother's eyes. My mother left Boston because she didn't want the life you're offering. She chose adventure and love over society and status. I'm making the same choice. Vivian looked stricken. I'm not your enemy, child. I'm family. Then respect my choice, Lena said. Respect that I found a home and a father who sees me as I am, not as what I could become if properly molded. There was a long, painful silence. Webb shifted uncomfortably. Emma stood ready to intervene if needed. Elias remained still, letting Lena fight this battle herself. Finally, Vivian spoke, her voice thick with emotion. I see your mother in you, the same stubbornness, the same certainty about what she wanted. She pulled a handkerchief from her bag and dabbed at her eyes. I lost her because I couldn't accept her choices. I won't make that mistake again. She reached into her traveling bag and pulled out a small leather portfolio. These are photographs of Margaret when she was young, letters she wrote me before our estrangement, her parents' wedding rings, your grandparents' rings. I thought you might want them. A connection to the family you came from. Lena accepted the portfolio with trembling hands. Inside were tintype images of a young woman who looked heartbreakingly like Lena's mother. Letters in familiar handwriting, 2 gold bands worn smooth by time. Thank you, Lena whispered. There's also a bank book, Vivian continued. Money that belonged to your grandparents. It should have gone to Margaret, and now it's yours. Not much, a few $100s, but it's your inheritance, your birthright. Take it regardless of where you choose to live. Elias started to protest, but Vivian cut him off. This isn't charity, Mr. Creed. It's what's legally hers. And if you're truly her guardian, you'll make sure she has it. Elias nodded stiffly. We'll put it in a trust account, for her education or future needs. Vivian studied them both for a long moment. I came here prepared to fight for custody, to argue that blood and resources should prevail. But I see now that wouldn't honor Margaret's memory. She chose love over convention. Her daughter is doing the same. She looked at Lena. But would you allow me to remain in your life? As your aunt? I can't undo the years of absence, but perhaps I could be present, going forward. Letters, occasional visits if you're willing, a connection to your mother's side of the family. Lena looked up at Elias, seeking his opinion. He gave a small nod. This was her choice to make. Letters would be all right, Lena said slowly, and maybe visits. But this is my home. Elias is my father. That doesn't change. I understand. Vivian pulled out a calling card. This is my Boston address. Write to me if you wish. Tell me about your life, about what you're learning, about who you're becoming. And I'll tell you stories about your mother when she was young. About the sister I loved and lost and still miss every day. She offered the card to Lena, who took it carefully. Then on impulse, Lena stepped forward and hugged her aunt briefly. Vivian's arms came around her, holding tight for just a moment before releasing. Be happy, child, Vivian said, her voice breaking. Be loved. Be strong. That's all any of us can hope for." She turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing in the marble hallway. They watched until she disappeared around a corner, this ghost from Lena's mother's past, offering closure and connection in equal measure. Emma let out a breath. "Well, that was unexpected." "Life tends to be," Webb said dryly. He looked at Elias. "You handled that well, both of you. Many people would have been threatened by the appearance of wealthy family offering opportunities." "Opportunities mean nothing if you're not free to be yourself," Elias said. He looked down at Lena. "You did good, speaking up like that. Your mother would have been proud." Lena clutched the portfolio and the calling card, these tangible pieces of a past she'd thought was lost forever. "Can we go home now?" "Yeah," Elias said gently. "We can go home." The journey back to the mountain took 2 days. They stayed overnight at the Morrison farm, where Emma's family celebrated the guardianship approval with a special dinner and stories around the fire. Lena felt wrapped in warmth and community. This network of people who'd chosen to support her and Elias, despite what society said was proper. The next day, they climbed back up the mountain trail. As the forest closed around them and civilization fell away, Lena felt something in her chest unclench. The city had been necessary, the legal process important, but this wilderness, this isolation, this quiet, this was where she belonged. When the cabin finally came into view, Lena felt tears prick her eyes. It looked exactly the same as when they'd left, but somehow more precious. This was home. Really, truly home, now protected by law and choice and love. That evening, they sat by the fire as they had so many times before, but now there was a new ease between them, a certainty that hadn't existed before. The legal papers sat on the table, official proof that they belonged to each other. Vivian's portfolio rested on Lena's lap, and she looked through the photographs of her mother as a young woman, so full of life and dreams. "She looks happy in these pictures," Lena said quietly. "Before she met my father, before she left Boston, but I think she was happier after. On the road, building something new, choosing her own path." "That's what freedom looks like," Elias said. "Sometimes it's messy and hard and doesn't look like much from the outside. But it's yours. Nobody else gets to define it for you." Lena looked at him, this man who'd saved her, protected her, given her back her voice and her strength. "Thank you for fighting for me, for not giving up when it would have been easier to let them take me away." Giving up was never an option. Elias's voice was rough with emotion. "You're my daughter, Lena. That's not just a legal designation. That's truth. And I'll fight for you every day if I have to." They sat together as the fire burned low, this makeshift family forged in loss and rebuilt through choice. Outside, the mountain settled into night. The familiar sounds of wind in the pines, distant owl calls, the creek running fast with snowmelt. Inside, the cabin was warm and safe, and filled with the quiet understanding of people who belonged together. Over the following weeks, life returned to its comfortable rhythm. Elias began teaching Lena more advanced skills, how to track animals, how to read weather patterns, how to use the rifle properly now that she was getting bigger and stronger. She proved a quick study, her confidence growing with each new accomplishment. True to her word, Lena wrote to Aunt Vivian. The letters were brief at first. Simple updates about life on the mountain, descriptions of the changing seasons, stories about Emma's visits. Vivian wrote back with tales of Margaret as a child, filling in pieces of Lena's family history she'd never known. The correspondence became a bridge between past and present, a way to honor her mother while building her future. Summer arrived in a riot of wildflowers and long golden days. The garden flourished under Lena's care, producing more vegetables than 2 people could eat. They shared the surplus with the Morrisons and with occasional travelers who passed through seeking shelter or supplies. The cabin became known as a place of hospitality despite its isolation, and Lena learned the value of generosity from watching Elias share what they had without expecting anything in return. In July, Officer Webb made his first annual welfare visit. He spent an afternoon at the cabin observing Lena reading aloud from one of the books on the shelf, watching her help prepare dinner, talking with her about her education and her life. His report was glowing, noting that she'd grown 2 inches, gained healthy weight, and displayed confidence and capability well beyond her years. I've seen a lot of children in difficult situations, Webb told Elias as he prepared to leave. Most of them are just surviving, getting through each day. But Lena's thriving. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. As autumn approached again, marking a full year since the auction, Lena stood in the clearing looking down at the valley, where Stillwater was just a smudge of smoke in the distance. So much had changed in 12 months. She'd found her voice. She'd found her strength. She'd found a father and a home and a future that belonged entirely to her. The girl who'd stood on that auction platform, silent, terrified, broken, was gone. In her place stood someone new, someone who knew how to plant gardens and preserve food, who could read tracking signs and identify plants, who could stand in front of judges and administrators and defend her right to live on her own terms. She heard Elias's uneven footsteps approaching and turned to see him carrying a bundle of firewood. Getting cold earlier this year, he observed, stacking the wood in the shed. Winter's going to be hard again. We'll be ready, Lena said confidently, and they would be. Together, they could face anything. That evening, Elias pulled out a surprise he'd been working on in his workshop, a set of bookshelves he'd built specifically for Lena's room. They were beautiful pieces, carved with simple flower patterns that matched her treasure box. For all the books you'll collect over the years, he said, helping her install them on her wall. And for the journals you'll fill with your own stories. Every life worth living is worth documenting. Lena ran her fingers over the carved flowers. Will you teach me wood carving? I want to learn to make beautiful things too. Of course. We'll start with simple projects and work up to more complex ones. He stepped back to admire the installed shelves. You've got good hands for detail work. Could be you'll surpass me before too long. They spent the rest of the evening filling the shelves with Lena's growing collection of books. Some purchased with money from her inheritance fund, others traded for or gifted by Emma and the Morrisons. Each one represented knowledge gained, worlds explored, possibilities imagined. As winter closed in again, the cabin became a cocoon of warmth and learning. Elias taught Lena mathematics and history from his own limited but solid education. She read voraciously, everything from agricultural manuals to poetry collections. They worked on wood carving projects together, Lena's small hands learning to coax beauty from raw lumber. Emma visited when weather allowed, bringing not just supplies, but companionship and laughter. She and Lena would spend hours talking about everything and nothing, books they'd read, dreams they had, the complexities of being young women in a world that had very specific ideas about what they should be. You're going to do something remarkable, Emma told Lena one snowy afternoon as they worked on embroidery. I can feel it. You're not the kind of person who just exists. You're the kind who changes things. Lena considered this. I just want to be happy and free and useful. Is that remarkable? In this world? For a girl? Yes. That's revolutionary. The second winter was easier than the first. Lena knew what to expect now, knew how to pace herself through the long, dark months, knew that spring would eventually return. She and Elias had fallen into an easy partnership, working together, learning together, supporting each other through hard days, and celebrating small victories. On Christmas, Lena gave Elias a carved bookmark she'd made herself, simple but serviceable, with his initials burned into the wood. He gave her a new journal with leather binding and her name embossed on the cover. For your stories, he said. Everyone should document their journey. Someday you might want to remember exactly how you got from there to here. Lena opened the journal and wrote on the first page, This is the story of how I found my voice, my strength, and my home. This is the story of how broken things can heal. This is the story of family by choice. Spring returned with its usual fanfare of melting snow and returning birds. Officer Webb made his second annual visit and found everything in order. Lena had grown again, her dresses from last year now too short. She'd mastered basic carpentry, could handle the rifle competently, and was reading at a level well above her age. Remarkable progress, Webb noted in his report. The child continues to thrive in an unconventional but clearly nurturing environment. As Lena approached her 9th birthday, or what they estimated was close to it, since exact records had been lost in the accident, she stood taller and straighter than the frightened child who'd arrived on the mountain. Her dark hair hung in a neat braid. Her eyes, once empty and hopeless, now sparkled with curiosity and determination. Her voice, silent for so long, now rang clear and strong, whether reading aloud, asking questions, or telling Elias about her day. One warm May evening, they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the valley. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and the air smelled of pine and possibility. "Do you ever regret it?" Lena asked quietly. "Taking me in? Your life would have been simpler without me." Elias was quiet for a moment, considering his answer carefully. "Simple isn't always better. Before you came, I was just existing, going through motions, waiting to die without admitting that's what I was doing." He looked at her, his scarred face gentle in the fading light. "You gave me purpose again, reminded me what it means to care about someone more than yourself. That's not a burden, Lena. That's a gift." "You gave me a gift too," Lena said. "You saw me when nobody else did. You fought for me when it would have been easier not to. You taught me that being different isn't the same as being broken, and that family is about choice as much as blood." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the day fade into night. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, not threatening, just announcing its presence to the darkening world. The sound used to frighten Lena. Now it just felt like part of the mountain's song, wild and free and unapologetic. The years that followed brought their share of challenges and changes. Lena continued to grow, both physically and in confidence. She developed a talent for wood carving that eventually surpassed Elias's, creating pieces so beautiful that traders would make the difficult journey up the mountain just to purchase them. The money went into her inheritance fund, building her future one carved flower, one detailed animal, one intricate pattern at a time. She maintained her correspondence with Aunt Vivian, and when Lena turned 12, Vivian made the long journey from Boston to visit for 2 weeks. The reunion was bittersweet, Vivian bringing stories and photographs of Margaret, Lena sharing the life she'd built on the mountain. They were different people from different worlds, but they found common ground in their love for the woman who'd connected them. Emma Morrison eventually married a young rancher from the next valley over, but she remained a constant presence in Lena's life. The two young women maintained a friendship that transcended age and circumstance, bound by mutual respect and genuine affection. Officer Webb's annual visits became anticipated events. He'd spend an afternoon at the cabin, checking on Lena's welfare, but mostly just visiting, sharing news from the territorial capital, discussing politics and progress, marveling at how much the quiet child had blossomed into a capable young woman. The town of Stillwater slowly changed its opinion about Elias Creed and his adopted daughter. The whispers and suspicions faded as evidence mounted that something good had grown from that controversial auction. When Lena accompanied Elias to town for supplies, people began greeting her by name, asking about her work, treating her like a person rather than a curiosity. By the time Lena reached 15, she'd grown into a young woman who carried herself with quiet confidence. She stood eye to eye with Emma now, her dark hair worn in practical braids, her hands calloused from work, but capable of creating beauty from wood and words. She'd filled multiple journals with stories and observations, documented her journey from broken child to strong young woman. The cabin on the mountain had evolved too. What had been a lonely hermit's hideaway had become a real home, expanded with an addition that gave Lena her own proper bedroom, surrounded by gardens that fed them year-round, decorated with carved pieces, and Emma's embroidery and books collected over years. One evening, as Elias and Lena worked on a particularly complex carving project together, she asked the question that had been on her mind for weeks. "What happens when I'm grown, when I don't need you to take care of me anymore?" Elias set down his carving knife and looked at her. "Then you decide what happens next. Maybe you stay on the mountain, maybe you go to the city, maybe you travel like your mother wanted to. The guardianship papers ensure you're free to choose your path when the time comes. And if I choose to stay, to keep living here, then you're welcome for as long as you want. This is your home, Lena, not because you're a child who needs protecting, but because you belong here, because we're family." He paused. "But I won't hold you to the mountain if you want to explore the world. Your mother chose adventure over security. You might want to do the same." "I might," Lena admitted. "Someday, but not yet. There's still so much to learn here, about carpentry and tracking and survival, about what it means to build a life on your own terms." She smiled. You're still teaching me things. And you're still teaching me, Elias said. That's how it works with family. We learn from each other. The years continued their steady march. Lena grew into a woman known throughout the territory for her carved work, her independence, and her fierce loyalty to the mountain man who'd saved her. Elias grew older, his hair fully silver now, his limp more pronounced in cold weather, but his mind sharp and his hands still capable of fine work. When Lena turned 18, officially an adult by territorial law, they had a quiet celebration at the cabin. Emma and her husband came, bringing their 2 young children. The Morrisons made the journey from their farm. Even Officer Webb, though his formal visits had ended when Lena reached 16, attended to mark the occasion. To Lena, Emma toasted, raising her glass. Who taught us all that family is what you build, not just what you're born into? Who showed us that broken things can heal, and that love is sometimes found in the most unexpected places? They drank to that, this gathering of people who'd watched a frightened child transform into a confident woman. Later, after everyone had left and the cabin was quiet again, Elias gave Lena her final gift, the deed to the mountain property, transferred into her name. It's yours now, he said simply, legal and binding. This land, this cabin, everything we've built, it belongs to you, not as my ward or my dependent, but as yourself. Free and clear. Lena held the deed with trembling hands. But it's your home. It's our home, and it always will be, for as long as I'm here. But when I'm gone, I want you to know it's still yours, that you'll always have this place to return to build on, to pass on to whoever you choose. His voice roughened. You gave me back my life, Lena. Seems only right I give you something permanent in return. They stood together on the porch, this father and daughter, who'd chosen each other against all odds and all expectations. The mountain spread around them, wild and beautiful and unapologetically itself, just like them. Thank you, Lena said quietly, for everything, for seeing me when nobody else did, for fighting for me, for teaching me to be strong. Thank you for reminding me what living means, Elias replied, for being brave enough to speak up when it mattered, for making this cabin a home again instead of just a place to hide. The sun set over the valley, painting the sky in brilliant colors. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled its evening song. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of wood smoke and possibility. And on the mountain, in a cabin that had witnessed transformation and healing, 2 people stood together, bound not by blood or law or convention, but by the fierce, unbreakable love of family, chosen in freedom and forged in trust. The girl nobody wanted had become the woman who knew her worth. The broken man hiding from his past had become the father who built a future. Together, they'd created something that couldn't be measured or judged or confined by society's narrow definitions. They'd created home, they'd created family, they'd created hope, and that was enough. That was everything.